Eagles Entertainment.
The journey of the draft is driven by AAA. AAA, roadside is their strong side. Make AAA a part of your game day today. AAA, go ahead.
With the 25th pick in the NFL Draft, the Philadelphia Eagles select.
You're listening to the Journey to the Draft podcast, driven by AAA.
Welcome to the Journey to the Draft podcast, driven by AAA. I'm your host, Fran Duffy. We've got a very unique show today. It's going to be a little bit long. It's going to be right around 2 hours, but this is going to be a fun discussion with Ben Fennell and I as we look back to the 2016 NFL Draft. And look, I'm going to tee up this conversation a little bit later. I don't want to dive too deep into what we're going to talk about, but let me just say this. NFL teams, all 32 teams, and all of the scouts, all the general managers, all the decision makers, head coaches included, they're all held to the fire when it comes to their draft selections, right? Their livelihoods depend on how they rank and how they stack and how they select players and acquire them through the NFL draft. So us on the outside, in the media, we don't face that same level of scrutiny, that same level of urgency, both inside the building and outside the building when it comes to the media. So knowing that, to me, I'm always big on trying to improve myself and trying to look back and see, okay, why was this wrong? Why was that wrong? And you can't always get all of the answers, especially when it comes to, players all around the league, and all these guys are individual cases as to why they work and don't work. But it's always kind of fun to just kind of look back, read through some notes that you had on players from 4, 5, 6 years ago after they're very well established in the league or established that they are not in the league. And to me, having this discussion with Ben is something that we have little tiny conversations like this really all year round. But being able to sit down and do this in a long form fashion, it's a lot of fun. I hope you guys enjoy it. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, go on, rate the show, leave us a rating wherever you listen to the podcast, whether it's on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. Leave us a rating. If you leave us a comment, really, really helps boost us up the rankings. Look, we've got some big news for this podcast coming up here in the next couple of weeks, and I cannot wait to share it with you guys because we've got really, really big plans. It's something I think you are all going to be really, really excited about. But just give us that rating, give us that comment. That helps boost us up the rankings a little bit. But again, excited for what the future holds here on the Journey to the Draft podcast, driven by AAA. All right, let's get things started here. It's time now for Draft Buzz.
Now it's time for Draft Buzz.
All right, so like I said, this week on the Journey to the Draft podcast, driven by AAA, we're going to take a little bit of a trip back into the Wayback Machine, look back to 4 drafts ago, the 2016 NFL Draft. And obviously, if you're an Eagles fan, this was the Carson Wentz draft, the first draft with Howie Roseman and Doug Peterson together at the helm of the Eagles. And this was a huge draft for that franchise. But Ben, before we dive into round 1, I want to just kind of ask you this question, just to kind of tee off the conversation. When you're looking back at draft classes, how do you judge success? When you're talking about a team's success in a draft, do you judge it off of, hey, they got 1 or 2 players? Is it a certain amount of starters? Is it guys that, went on to have second contracts with the team? If they got good value on day 3, is it just based purely off your own evaluations? How do you look at a class and years later say, yeah, that was a really good job by that team in that draft?
There's so many different ways to measure the draft class. I'm not sure there's a clear black and white kind of answer, because as much as I want to say, well, it's the number of impact players or the number of players you fill out your roster to. But what if you developed a great player and then traded them? That's asset development as well, and acquiring, other abilities to improve your roster through outside means. That's a really interesting question. I don't think there's one way to kind of measure it, but this exercise, I think, is a great way to reflect back, because I don't think enough people go backwards in the draft. It's so much projecting forward and the next year. Nobody really goes back and checks the receipts from 4 or 5 drafts ago. And I think this 2016 draft in particular had a lot of unique case studies. A lot of weird things happened during the draft. And there's a lot of interesting careers to follow since then. So looking back at a draft class now that we're 4 years removed, I think is a really healthy exercise to see who was taken, why were they taken, over who, and where has their career gone since. And that's really kind of putting together the pieces of this puzzle of saying who is successful in this draft and who is not. And I think we're going to look at it from a number of different angles.
Yeah, and to me, I think when a lot of people, whether it's a podcast or an article, when they do these look backs at drafts from a few years ago, it's about, we're going to regrade the draft and do this and that. To me, like, I want this conversation to be more self-reflection. You know me, like, I'm always kind of trying to self-scout, trying to improve my process and kind of look back to how I viewed a lot of these guys and, some of my hits, some of my misses. And that's kind of how I want to kind of structure this conversation. And real quick, we'll kind of start with the first round. Obviously, that gets so much of the attention every single year is the first round of the draft. And only 31 picks in this first round. The Patriots, because of Deflategate, did not have a first-round pick. So that pick was thrown out. 31 selections. I was kind of interested to just kind of go through this, Ben. 11 of the 31 picks have already gone to a Pro Bowl. That includes the first 7 picks. So all of 7 of these first picks that we're going to talk about all have gone to a Pro Bowl already. 18 of these guys, so 18 of 31, are already on new teams. That includes some of these Pro Bowl players as well. And 2 of them are out of the league. They're not even on a team as of this recording. So that just kind of speaks to how quickly things can turn for these guys. When you're talking round 1 picks and people say, oh, it's 50-50. Not quite 50-50 from this draft, and a ton of talented players for sure. And you're gonna hear about them. Some of the best players in the NFL at their respective positions, and also a lot of players that frankly just did not work out and are already with another city. And let's just kick things off here. We're gonna go 5 picks at a time in the first round before we start talking a little bit later in the draft. First overall, the Rams traded up. They traded up with the Tennessee Titans. They took Jared Goff. Second overall, as if you're an Eagles fan, you know this, the Eagles traded up twice, first with Miami to get to number 8, and then with Cleveland to get to number 2 to select quarterback Carson Wentz out of North Dakota State. Number 3, the Chargers took Joey Bosa out of Ohio State. Number 4, the Dallas Cowboys took running back Ezekiel Elliott from Ohio State. And then 5th overall, the Jacksonville Jaguars took Jalen Ramsey out of Florida State. And he's now obviously with the LA Rams. So, Ben, any kind of takeaways here, I guess, from the first 5? I think there's a lot of discussion that we could have just from these first 5 picks alone.
Yeah, I think, just kind of laying out the landscape of the narratives going into this draft is obviously quarterback dominant. And I think Goff going 1, Wentz going 2 really laid the road and the path for this draft. And I think it was a deep quarterback class going in. Even, the top heavy part, the back end of round 1, even developmental guys when you get into, what Jacoby Brissett did at NC State, Cody Kessler. Yep. Man, I love Connor Cook coming out in this class as well. I think it was pretty deep. Cardell Jones, Kevin Hogan, Sudfeld. There's a lot of guys to look at. And I think Goff Wentz going 1, 2. And then obviously Bosa, Zeke, Jalen Ramsey, who is my number 1 overall player in this class. There's some argument on whether you want to call him a safety or a corner, but not the deepest cornerback class. And I think we'll get into that in a couple minutes here.
To me, I think the big discussion, there were 2 big ones here, right? It was Goff versus Wentz. And me personally, I was a Wentz guy. Wentz was actually, and I think still looking back, I actually have to look back over the last 2 drafts, but I'm pretty sure that Carson Wentz is still my favorite quarterback that I've ever studied coming out of college. Maybe I think alongside Andrew Luck. I think Luck might be the only one that I think I gave a higher grade to coming out of college. But I was a Carson Wentz guy over Jared Goff. The other big one, though, was what would the Cowboys do? Because first of all, a lot of people, early on in the process will go around Senior Bowl time was, oh man, Carson Wentz is going to end up in Dallas. He's going to go 4th overall to the Dallas Cowboys. And so, the Eagles being able to move up ahead of them and get to number 2 and secure the fact that they were going to get Carson Wentz, I thought was huge. But after that move was made, it was all right, well, will the Cowboys take Ezekiel Elliott because they needed, they needed a running back and all that, or would they take Jalen Ramsey? Would they take one of these offensive tackles? Would they take a DeForest Buckner? There are all these other options here for them. If Joey Bosa fell to them, would they take Bosa? They end up taking the running back. And look, they followed through. Elliott has turned into one of the 1 or 2 best running backs in the NFL. Whenever he's been on the field, he's been an impact player for them. They backed that up by paying him a huge contract last offseason. But I think the idea of, taking Ezekiel Elliott over Jalen Ramsey, that to me, looking back on that 4 years later, it's a very valid discussion when it comes to team building and just kind of the philosophy of player acquisition and trying to build around the value of the team.
Yeah, don't you feel like Ezekiel Elliott is one of those rare case studies of a top 10 running back looking back 4 or 5 years later and saying, you know what, I think we're happy with that selection. Yeah. And I feel like these days that doesn't seem to happen. I think of Christian McCaffrey, and then that seems to run out of steam. And I think Ezekiel Elliott coming out was the full package in every phase and every facet of running back play you could possibly ask for. He was a really tough player to skip over there at 4 with their already dominant offensive line. They obviously had some, future of the quarterback position in limbo at the moment there, but bolstering the O-line with the running game and a top flight running back. It's just one of those rare examples where I think it warranted a top 10 pick. And I think looking back, the Cowboys are probably happy with that pick.
Well, I think they did it in a way that was smart. In terms of, like, if you're going to take the guy that high, he's got to be the foundation of the offense. And there's no question that, again, when he's been on the field, he has been the foundation of that offense. I know they went a little bit more pass happy last year with Dak, and we'll see how they ultimately orchestrate that offense this year with Mike McCarthy. But he has been the igniter of that offense. It goes through him, both in the run game, and obviously we've seen him more in the passing game as well. So if you're going to take a guy that high, number one, you want to be on the precipice of success. And, that Cowboys team, they felt like they were. You mentioned they were in a little bit of a transition period. Tony Romo was dealing with his injuries. They take Dak Prescott later in this draft in the 4th round, and he becomes the starter right away. And obviously he has boatloads of success. But to me, I think when you look at taking a running back high, it's all about trying to leverage that guy as quickly as possible, especially if you're going to take him in the 1st round, especially if you're going to take him in the top 15 or in this case in the top 5. Everything's got to go through him. And that's what I said the same thing, what was it, a year or two later when the Giants selected Saquon Barkley. The offense needs to go through that player.
Yeah, absolutely. An interesting perspective with this draft is I was on the set with NFL Network, and we had Urban Meyer for night 1. So there was 5 Ohio State Buckeyes selected in round 1. In addition to Mike Thomas going early in round 2, Noah Spence, the Ohio State transfer. So really interesting perspective to hear some of his little notes and thoughts to Mike Mayock, some off the record, some on the record on camera, but really interesting kind of nuggets and perspective on the players I'll try to divulge when possible.
The last thing I want to talk about with these 5 guys was, to me, one of the big questions I had about Jared Goff was, at that point, there weren't a lot of quarterbacks that came from that system or that family of systems with the air raid. And he played for Sonny Dykes at Cal, in that offense. There weren't a lot of guys that had that level of success in the NFL. And now we've seen those guys come in and have much more success. Obviously, Patrick Mahomes is a big one, but we saw Baker Mayfield go number 1 overall. We saw Kyler Murray go number 1 overall. We've seen more guys at quarterback at that position come out and have success. But to that level, to me, I think, again, it speaks to, hey, what has Sean McVay done with Jared Goff? He's playing to his strengths, and he's trying to, mask his weaknesses, and everything that he did with him early in his career. And there's been a lot written about it, is, what he did pre-snap in terms of getting into Goff's ear and helping him set things pre-snap. It's not the same now as it was then, but just allowing him to have that early success by, massaging those weaknesses and say, okay, I don't want to put this on your plate. I know that these were your issues coming out, but I want you to be able to play fast and be able to do a lot of the things that you do well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jared Goff, my main criticism and why I had Carson Wentz over Jared Goff was Wentz's ability to extend the play, make more plays outside the pocket, out of structure, in the pocket and outside the pocket. In addition to the QB run game of Carson Wentz is really impressive. But Jared Goff, you look at how he played with Sonny Dykes, kind of a structured air raid system. I thought he struggled to break the pocket when he needed to or make those second reaction throws. But when you get to a Sean McVay offense, that's not what he's asking them to do. It's very much a timing-based offense, a lot of play action built on the run game, and then making the shot plays off of play action. But it's very much a structured offense. I'm just trying to think in my head right now, how many plays has Jared Goff made outside of structure in his 4 years in the NFL? And probably not a whole lot. And this is a guy that went to a Super Bowl. So he's had success, was one of the best quarterbacks in the league 2 years ago, and did it his way. And I think McVay, using his skill set to his advantage and not building an offense to, cater to somebody that doesn't have that skill set. And I think there's more and more of that in the NFL, and trying to build offenses around skill sets rather than trying to peg guys into systems.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. Let's get to these next 5 here. 6th overall, the Baltimore Ravens took tackle Ronnie Stanley. He's turned into a great player. San Francisco took defensive lineman DeForest Buckner, also a great player, now obviously traded to the Indianapolis Colts for a first-round selection. The next 3 picks is where we get into some of the selections that didn't work out as well. Tennessee traded up to number 8 to take tackle Jack Conklin from Michigan State. The Chicago Bears traded up to take Leonard Floyd out of Georgia. That was a guy I was very high on, and I missed on that one. The New York Giants selected Eli Apple from Ohio State. So from those 5, any kind of takeaway? I don't think we'll have as many takeaways for these next bunch of picks as we did for the first 5. But any takeaways here from 6 through 10?
No, I think this started the run on tackles. We knew it was going to be kind of a deep and a top-heavy tackle class. And obviously the issues at Larry Tunsil and the gas mask video and him sliding really dominated the narrative and some of the talking points right now. Potentially the reason why a Ronnie Stanley or a Conklin leapfrogged Larry Tunsil on draft night. Larry Tunsil has lived up to the bill of being a first round pick, but where he went in that first round was very much in debate because of that strange incident in video. But yeah, Leonard Floyd was a guy I was a little bit more down on coming out of Georgia, more of the lean, wiry type of edge rusher, not so much of the technical kind of brute edge setting run stuffer that I like my edges to also contribute with. So some differing in opinions there. And DeForest Buckner, a really, really interesting player coming out of Oregon. I see him here listed as defensive end and probably only played a couple snaps, outside on the edge in his career in San Francisco, but a guy that showed some versatility on tape at Oregon and really could play up and down the defensive line. Good pick from the Niners.
Yeah, I'm looking back at my report on Leonard Floyd and just a couple of things I wrote. I said one of my absolute favorite players in this draft, a special talent at the linebacker spot, offers value immediately, at least as a sub rusher, with his ability to be an immediate starter in a 3-4 scheme on either side, or as a 4-3 Sam linebacker. I thought he had Pro Bowl potential because of that pass rush upside. And I compared him. I wrote down two players in my player comparison, Ben. I wrote down Anthony Barr and Bruce Irvin. And I said, look, he's better than Bruce Irvin was coming out of West Virginia. And Irvin, I believe, was the 15th overall pick back in 2012. But he could fill a similar role right away as a sub-package rusher and then grow into the Sam linebacker spot for a 4-3 team. Or he could start right away in a 3-4. Obviously, they played a 3-4 scheme for much of his career in Chicago. But I was expecting a little bit more. Now Leonard Floyd just signed in free agency with the LA Rams. So he goes and joins actually Jalen Ramsey, another top 5 pick in this class out west with the Rams.
Yeah, I was just a little afraid with Leonard Floyd and a little bit of the flashes of the Deion Jordan from a couple of years earlier with Oregon and being that lean, wiry, really athletic. But, how is he going to be at the point of attack in the NFL? And I think that's kind of where Floyd has struggled a little bit in his NFL career, is just putting on the weight and being an early down player as well. We knew he had the explosive athleticism to go hunt quarterbacks and be a cool pressure package piece on third down.
I just think, and just kind of reflecting on that, that was a big one for me. I wasn't a huge Vic Beasley fan, but watching him, and he did have some success early in his career, and obviously kind of tapered off. Watching Leonard Floyd have the lack of success that he had, and some of these other guys that are built that way. You mentioned a Deion Jordan as well. Man, I really have a hard time of buying into those kind of lean, wiry pass rushers now in the college level. Like I feel like I need to be able to see a certain level of play strength. I need the ability to win with power off the edge. I did that coach's masterclass with Matt Burke a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about power. Yeah, that was right at the defensive tackle spot, but I think it matters for the edge rushers as well. Think of who the top pass rushers are year over year in the NFL. Outside of like Von Miller, most of these guys are power guys. They're leverage players, guys that can win in a multitude of ways. They're not just going to run by you each and every snap.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because there's a guy later in this draft that I think fits that profile as well, and Yannick Ngakoue, who is a little bit of an undersized, leaner, can turn the corner on you. And when we were looking at Leonard Floyd here in that 9th pick and seeing the Bears trade up, Noah Spence was very much in play at this spot. Shaq Lawson was very much in play. Emmanuel Ogbah was very much in play. I had no idea where the Bears were going to go at this point, because Leonard Floyd was viewed so different from different teams and evaluators at the time. But they have obviously saw something they really liked. He was athletic, lean, long. And immediately here, I'm looking back at my notes and how they used him in preseason. Immediately, third down, moving him around, second level, tons of stunts, tons of twists, trying to get him on the move and using that, lean body and those long strides.
All right, well, let's get to the next group here. For 11th overall, the Tampa Bay Bucks took Vernon Hargreaves, which at the time was viewed as one of the safest picks in the draft. The 12th overall, New Orleans Saints take Sheldon Rankins, who maybe Wikipedia is wrong. He's never made a Pro Bowl. Sheldon Rankins has never been to a Pro Bowl. That guy is so good, but left off that group of Pro Bowlers that we mentioned at the top here. Laramie Tunsil falling all the way to 13, as you mentioned. He was my number 1 player overall in this class. I loved Laramie Tunsil coming out of Ole Miss, and obviously fell for different reasons. 14th overall, the Oakland Raiders selected Carl Joseph out of West Virginia. And then 15th overall, the Cleveland Browns selected Corey Coleman, the wide receiver from Baylor. So I think some interesting kind of topics here. Ben, any takeaways off the top from these 5 guys?
No, not particularly. I liked Vernon Hargreaves until he had to test and run, and that was kind of the knock on those Florida boys, him and Tease Tabor in this class. I think both struggled in their 40-yard dash time, if I remember correctly. Sheldon Rankins, I think, had a dominant Senior Bowl week that really got himself in the first-round conversation. Tunsil, we talked before about the slide with the weird gas mask incident, and he was a top 5 tackle all day long. Carl Joseph, very interesting. If I'm not mistaken, injured going into the draft process, did not participate at the combine, injured going into, draft night. So we both really liked him on tape, made some huge plays, from the middle of the field out to the sideline there at West Virginia, some huge hits, big plays on the ball. We started to get some flashes to say, hey, is this maybe a Tyrann Mathieu style of back end, jack of all trades, ball magnet on the back end? And then Corey Coleman out of Baylor, setting all sorts of records, 20-plus touchdowns down there in the Big 12. But he was a tough one to figure out. He's a really strong player, made plays kind of vertically in that offense, kind of strong after the catch, but didn't have the nuanced route running. I think that's what eventually bit him in the butt the second he got to the NFL.
I wasn't a big Carl Joseph guy. I think I had him as my 7th or 8th safety. I had Jalen Mills ahead of him. I had a bunch of guys ahead of Carl Joseph. My question was that I thought, and I'm just literally reading off my notes here. I thought he was a flash player that had moments where he looked like a future All-Pro, but I didn't see it consistently. I didn't think his 2014 season, so the junior year, the year before, I didn't think that was particularly strong. And he did rebound fairly well for his senior year. I thought he was really physical. I wrote down Cam Chancellor. I thought that he could be that kind of presence. I didn't see a guy that could play, deep down the field and be an impact player. I think the play everyone pointed to, was it Oklahoma, where he kind of showed that big play outside the numbers where he made a play along the sideline. But I just didn't see it consistently enough. And he was a guy that I think people thought, all right, he's probably like a 4.6 guy. You're right that he didn't test, he didn't go through stuff at the combine, but I wasn't a big Carl Joseph guy coming out. I liked Keanu Neal. Keanu Neal, we're going to talk about here coming up. Keanu Neal, I believe, was my top safety in this class. I felt that he was a better pick overall in terms of his transition to the NFL. The thing with Corey Coleman that I think is really interesting is, kind of going back to receivers from that style of offense in terms of where he lines up just at one spot. He only ran routes from one side of the formation, but he had all the athletic traits you were looking for. He wasn't super explosive, but he was quick in and out of breaks. He was super competitive with everything he did with the ball in his hands. He would go up and battle. There were things that you liked and then things that you didn't. There were some questions there. And obviously, he's been on, is it 3 different teams or 4 different teams since, he was drafted 15th overall. But that's certainly an interesting evaluation for sure.
Yeah, I'll tell you, if Corey Coleman and Josh Doxson did anything to me in this draft class, they just skewed my view on some of the corners coming out of the Big 12. Because these guys just absolutely tore up some of these corners on Saturdays that I thought couldn't play a lick. And we're talking, Darryl Worley or Zach Sanchez and some guys like that were NFL prospects, and it got absolutely carved up on Saturdays by these guys. And then have kind of quietly turned into nice NFL players, Darryl Worley particularly, and a couple other ones I'm blanking on. But just kind of funny how that happens, aesthetically.
To me, the receiver position is just such an interesting one to study. We're going to talk a little bit about it here coming up. The next 5 picks here, 3 pretty good ones to get things going here. 16th overall, the Detroit Lions took Taylor Decker, who has not turned into an all-pro or anything, but it's turned into a solid, reliable starter at left tackle, which I think that's kind of all you can ask for. Taking him at 16. 17th overall, the Atlanta Falcons took Keanu Neal, who, when healthy, has been, exactly what they were hoping for. Ryan Kelly, the center from Alabama, was the 18th pick to the Indianapolis Colts. That was a home run pick at the center spot for the Colts. And then 19, Buffalo took Shaq Lawson, who now just signed a free agent deal with the Miami Dolphins. He was a backup for the last couple of years in Buffalo. And then 20th overall, the New York Jets took Darren Lee, who I believe was on the Chiefs last year in their Super Bowl run, and as of this recording, has not signed a new deal with any team, so he's currently a free agent.
Yeah, kind of interesting group of players there. I'm kind of wondering how the Lions feel about the Taylor Decker pick, and if they think, looking back, if that was a good selection or not. Injured most of his sophomore year, second year, and really struggled to kind of bounce back from that. But 3 of the 4 years, that's starting left tackle behind Matt Stafford there. Yeah, and this kind of starts the conversation on the receiver class coming up here with some interesting picks. And I thought one of the safer picks in the entire class was Ryan Kelly coming out of Alabama. And I think that formula has kind of bled a little bit into the past couple draft classes to say,
Oh,
you
that's a
know
good
what?
point.
You're a little unsure where to go with the skill players or the quarterbacks and things like that. You know what? Taking an interior offensive lineman isn't the worst idea. And I think we've seen that later on, with some recent draft classes there, whether it's guard or some more runs on center. Then again, you see a pick here at the back end of round one that hasn't panned out in the interior offensive line. So it can go the other way as well.
Just going back to the Keanu Neal, like Carl Joseph discussion, like I remember watching Keanu Neal and you saw him do things that translated to the NFL. So it wasn't just like, oh, he's this big time athlete. I remember like, was it the year before was Malik Hooker coming out of Ohio State where it's like, oh man, like you just see him constantly just make play on the ball, make play on the ball, make play on the ball. Keanu Neal, like you saw him run the alley. You saw him play press man against the tight end. You saw him come down and be a robber underneath. You saw him play in the post. You saw him play too high. And he did all of these things and he was just checking boxes. It's like, man, like this guy does everything you want. He's tough. He's physical. He's instinctive. Like to me, like Keanu Neal, I think I actually wrote down that he was one of the safest projections for me. Hold on, here we go. Best cast as a strong safety, but he's athletic and instinctive enough to play deep. I think that he can be a day one starter and in the right scheme, be productive enough to be a Pro Bowl talent at the safety spot. Excellent player, really fun to watch. Also very fundamentally sound. I thought he was the best tackler in that draft as well at any position. So I was a really big fan of Keanu Neal. To me, there was another safety we'll talk about here in a little bit that I was a really, really big fan of. As well, but we'll get to him as we start talking about day 2 and day 3 selections. Let's go to the next one because you mentioned the wide receiver run kind of starts here on the back end of round 1. 21st overall, Houston Texans took Will Fuller, who, look, when healthy, very productive, very effective as that deep threat for Deshaun Watson, but the durability has been the question. Then you go to number 22, the Washington Redskins selected Josh Doxson. Now he's with the New York Jets, off injured with Washington. Minnesota took Laquan Treadwell out of Ole Miss. He's now in Atlanta. The Cincinnati Bengals took cornerback William Jackson, and then the Pittsburgh Steelers took cornerback Artie Burns. So a handful of picks here that didn't quite work out. Then you've got one in Will Fuller, who, when healthy, certainly is fitting the bill, but the health has been the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a quick little pros cons for what I had for these guys. Will Fuller, dynamic, explosive speed. Concerned about his hands. Does he have natural hands? Can he track the ball over the shoulder? Josh Doxson, extremely athletic, above the rim style player. Can he do anything with the yards after catch in a quick game, nuanced NFL route tree? And then Laquan Treadwell, physical player, strong hands, catch point player. Can he have a more diverse route tree in the NFL? Can he win above the rim against NFL corners? And I think that's the concern with those 50-50 ball players you see on Saturdays. Typically, that doesn't translate to the NFL. Much bigger corners, much more physical corners, much feistier corners that aren't going to allow them to just be beat by bigger receivers above the rim like you see on Saturdays.
Where did you see Treadwell ultimately? Like, how did you kind of view him transitioning into the NFL?
I really liked him. I thought he had a pretty good play presence. I didn't see a explosive over-the-top style player, but I thought he could have been a possession-like Alshon Jeffrey, still physical, still win in the red zone, win at the catch point. But there were some guys I just had above him. I was a huge Sterling Shepard fan. I really like Josh Doxson's tape at TCU and his athleticism and plays on the ball and acrobatic catches, one-handed catches. And Corey Coleman did very few things on tape to make you concerned about his play. He won against press coverage, off coverage, over the top, really strong hands, did some blocking as well, yards after catch. He did a lot of good things on tape, and obviously the stats and touchdowns showed it. It was very tough to kind of project Corey Coleman because it was more of the things you didn't see on tape,
right?
Not what he showed you. And I think there's a lot of interesting conversations for that on Saturdays to say what he's showing me is an A+. But we're also going to need to see X, Y, and Z, and what is that going to look like? And I think we get in those conversations and those debates every draft class.
Understand the limitations of the tape, as we remember from last summer. So I had all those guys ahead of Treadwell as well. The guy that I really was pounding the table for, I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, but we'll get to that here in a little bit. So it's a really good discussion when you're talking about the wide receivers. Let's get into the last 7 here. I just kind of grouped the last 7 selections together, really the last 6 selections. As I mentioned, the Patriots had to forfeit their draft pick. So 26th overall, the Denver Broncos selected Paxton Lynch from Memphis. Obviously did not work out. He's on now his third team. I think he was in Seattle and is now in Pittsburgh. Kenny Clark, really the last really strong pick on the back end of round one. Ended up being a really solid player for the Green Bay Packers. And probably, I would say probably more than that. He's a good player in the middle of that defensive line. San Francisco took Josh Garnett, the guard from Stanford. New England had the 29th pick and was forfeited. The 30th overall pick was to the Arizona Cardinals. They took Robert Nkemdiche out of Ole Miss, the third Ole Miss player in round one. 31st overall, the Carolina Panthers selected Vernon Butler, the defensive tackle from Louisiana Tech. And then the Seattle Seahawks took offensive lineman Jermaine Ifedi out of Texas A&M. He's obviously now with the Chicago Bears. So any takeaways here from the last handful of picks in round one, Ben?
No, not particularly. Paxton Lynch kind of squeezing in there in the round one. He was kind of a polarizing player to figure out at Memphis. All over the board for some projections. Some thought he'd be a top 5 pick right after Wentz. Some had more of a day 2 selection on him.
I think it goes back to what you said about Corey Coleman, like just understanding hey, the tape is one thing, but you have to take the full picture into account.
I thought Josh Garnett was a really strong player at Stanford. I thought he was one of the safer players to project. And then the rise of Vernon Butler was kind of an interesting player there from La Tech.
Do you have a good sense of why Garnett didn't really work out in San Francisco?
No, not particularly. I think he was one of the tough ones to figure out. Obviously, San Francisco is very much a evolving kind of unstable franchise at the time, both at the top with leadership and coaching staff. So sometimes that has an effect on players. And maybe he fell out of love with a certain coaching staff or that next one that came in that didn't select him. Sometimes, you just get rubbed the wrong way and you have an injury. I know he battled some things as well as a pro. So all that stuff in combination probably contributed.
One of the notes I had about Josh Garnett, I don't remember this, but I have it written down, was that he once ate 7 pieces of 24-ounce prime rib at the 2012 Laurie's Beef Bowl. So I guess at one of the bowl games, they had a eating competition, and he put down 7 pieces of 24-ounce prime rib. That's impressive.
That is pretty impressive. And I think there's a couple stories in this draft, particularly in the first round, to look back on and discuss why. And whether it's the Treadwell, Doxson Coleman, Robert Nkemdiche, the Reggie Ragland, Darren Lee conversation, Leonard Floyd. And I love talking about, in particularly, the Darren Lee conversation.
Yeah.
Because there's this style of linebacker every year, and they're what I call the halfway player. And in college football, they play the nickel Sam position. When there's 3 linebackers, that third linebacker is the Sam linebacker. Typically, he comes off the field for the nickelback player. So that's why we call him a nickel Sam. He'll play over the slot receiver, detached from the box. So if you're detached from the box, you're not accounted for in the run game. So you see these linebackers, and they come out every year. Terrell Hanks was one last year that came out. Fred Warner was one out of BYU. Darren Lee. They're not accounted for in the run game, so they come in free and make a lot of big plays on ball carriers in the box. They're going to make a lot of plays out to the sideline on receiver screens, like we saw from Darren Lee in that championship game against Alabama. He made a lot of plays on Amari Cooper on those quick screens to the outside. So you see the speed, you see the explosiveness sideline to sideline, but they are not true box linebackers. And I think we see those players out in space get excited about the speed, get excited about the playmaking, the huge hits on the ball carrier, a lot of times because they're unaccounted for. Then they get to the NFL and they say, you know what, let's put all these athletic linebackers at will. And that is not a catch-all for athletic positionless players in the NFL. And I have a packet here from a buddy of mine that interviewed for the San Francisco 49ers GM job about 12 years ago. And it says there, do not let the will linebacker be a catch-all for athleticism, because that's kind of that position that would just say, you know what, you're an oversized safety. Yeah, go be a will linebacker. You're an undersized edge rusher. Go be a will linebacker. It seemed to be this gravitational pull to take all these positionless players. And I think looking back on Darren Lee's tape and understanding why did he struggle with the Jets? Why is he on his 3rd team in the NFL in 4 years? I think there's some projection issues in what we saw at Ohio State and what they're asked to do in the NFL.
Well, that's what I think that, when we talk, and we've said it a couple times already, you have to have a full picture of what these guys are. We can watch the film. Everybody can watch the film and get a sense of, all right, this is the guy's strengths and weaknesses from his play personality and what he can bring to the table. But you have to have an understanding of what they can handle from a mental standpoint and, where they are from a work ethic standpoint. Because you mentioned all these guys that were those kind of overhang, halfway players, some of those guys have worked out, the Fred Warners of the world, and some of them haven't. And I think ultimately it comes down to, are they able to come in and adapt and try and learn and pick up something new? What they were asked in college doesn't always reflect how they're going to be used in the NFL, but you can still take those traits and say, okay, how does he project to what we want him to do? But that's an on the field question and an off the field question. I think that's a really good point. That's something that you always have to consider, because everybody out there that listens to the show that covers the draft and, follows the draft, some people say, I'm going to pay attention to off-field stuff and say that that's going to be important to my process. And then for other people, they'll say, since I can't get all the information, I'm going to push it aside. I'm not even going to consider it. I don't even want to talk about it. I don't want to think about it because I'm not going to get all the information, and therefore there's no point in me even trying. I think you need to kind of have that, though. And if you don't, that's fine. But then you have to just understand with the way that you kind of put players on display. And there are some that are great at doing that and say, look, like I'm going to take the off-field and put that aside. Here's what the film shows. This is what this guy can do on film. And I think that's kind of the way you have to approach it from a media standpoint when you're trying to follow and write reports and do all this on these guys.
Yeah, just to put a bow on that, the linebacker position I probably struggle with the most. And I really have to break down play by play and to say, he made a big play. What was he asked to do? What responsibility? What were his reads? What were his reactions? What were his keys? Because if you just look at big plays and get excited about the big plays, you kind of almost dilute your mind with how he got there. And it's such an evolving position in the NFL, probably the most evolving position over the last 10 years in the NFL. And I think it's really funny. Every commercial break, particularly in the back end of round one, Urban Meyer would nudge Mayock and say, what about Josh Perry? What do you think about Josh Perry? And just to remind you all, Josh Perry was the box linebacker on this Ohio State team, the run plugger, the 240-pound linebacker that no longer fit into today's NFL game. And Mayock said 10 years ago, he's a top 10 pick all day long. But in today's game, I don't know where he fits in.
Yep.
And then you see guys like Darren Lee get plucked off the board and struggle in the NFL. And I think it's just a really interesting kind of case study for this evolving linebacker position in the NFL. And there might be even a little bit of a case to say that position is actually bouncing back to some more size and physicality and making them more true box players, run stuffers, and having more situational linebackers and then come on the field on third down.
To me, like that's one of my favorite parts of the, what you and I do together throughout the course of the calendar year. We spend so much time watching film together. We watch NFL film, we watch college film, and when we're watching guys in the NFL, throughout the course of the year, it's always fun to kind of bring that conversation back to college evaluation, because you have to have an understanding of what works in the NFL, what doesn't work. So we'll be watching guys and saying, man, like you can't play linebacker in the league without XYZ. Like you need to be able to hold up here. You need to be able to accomplish this task. You need to be able to serve this role. If you can't do these things, then that's not going to work, or at least it's going to take time to be able to work. And I think, you can play that game across so many positions. That's part of the fun. Some of the things that we discuss every single week here on the Journey to the Draft podcast throughout the course of the year certainly makes it a lot of fun. All right.
And really quick, Fran, just to put a bow on the back end of round one, I think one of the kind of interesting players on this back end was Kenny Clark coming out of UCLA. And this conversation about whether these interior trench players are two-way players or not. And you had Vernon Butler and obviously Sheldon Rankins go in that kind of same ballpark. And Kenny Clark was more of that run plugger, the wrestling background that took some time to ascend into his game and has really turned into a good two-way player, had the wrestling background. But I think he came into the league as a 20-year-old. So just kind of want to hear your thoughts on maybe what he was for an age projection and then maybe a one-dimensional player coming out of the Pac-12 with the hopes of being a two-down, every-down player and where that value is in the draft. Because one of the other players that we thought was going to be in the first round all day long was Andrew Billings, that I thought showed you everything you wanted from an interior defensive tackle. He had the ability to get up the field on third down, win against a half man against the pass rush, and then was obviously that dominant run plugger and can make plays out to the numbers with good hustle. And then Kenny Clark was a little bit more one-dimensional there. So just kind of want to hear your thoughts there on that pecking order of D tackle.
Yeah, so I actually had Clark a few spots ahead of Andrew Billings. I had him a couple spots ahead of Vernon Butler as well. Here's what I wrote on Kenny Clark. So that he should start right away. While he might never be an all-pro caliber talent, Clark has the look of a longtime starter in the NFL, plays with great pad level. He knows how to use his hands. He anchors really well in the run game, and he's a better athlete than he's given credit for. Another thing I wrote down, just kind of going through some of my other notes as I was watching, this was like a verbatim thing as I was studying him. Starting NFL defensive lineman without question, outstanding bend, anchors down at the point of attack, great run defender, little things like his eye discipline, his ability to two-gap well. He's always square to the line of scrimmage. His hands are always in the right place. They all result in him being a very disruptive player. I really liked Kenny Clark. This was a really interesting group of interior defensive linemen in this class because you had the guys at the top that, you know, I think were universally loved, right? You had DeForest Buckner. I loved DeForest Buckner coming out. Sheldon Rankins, I was a big fan of. Kimdichie was a flash player that everybody acknowledged, you know, the athletic upside, but you questioned, you know, some of the off-field stuff there. But then you had some just guys that were rock solid, right? You had Ashawn Robinson, who I really liked, Jaron Reed, who I really liked, Jonathan Bullard I was higher on, I think, than most, Jihad Ward I was higher on than most, Austin Johnson out of Penn State. This was a really intriguing group of defensive linemen. So I think he kind of fell through the cracks for me a little bit there, but I liked him a little bit more than Billings because to me, like, Billings was a guy, we can talk about this a little bit as well, but, you know, he won just with pure power in that conference. Like he would just manhandle everybody in the Big 12. Like everyone he lined up against, you know, he was just under 6'1". He was only 311. So it's not like he was like a 330-pound destroyer on the inside. He wasn't like Vita Vea or like, you know, any of these other guys that came a little bit after him that, remember, Billings was in like first-round mock drafts, like pretty much throughout the entire process. I just didn't see that. I didn't see that guy that was going to always translate to the NFL. I kind of had Clark a few slots ahead of him for that reason. I just felt that he was a much easier transition with the way that he played, whereas Billings kind of relied more on raw ability and didn't quite have that level of athleticism that Clark had. I thought that Clark was a better athlete overall.
Yeah, I think Clark, just the age conversation, which some teams seem to value and some teams don't, coming into the league as a 20-year-old, this is a guy that's played 2,700 snaps and just turned 24 years old. There's guys that just came out in this draft class that were 24 years old. So it's really interesting to see when you're getting players, when that second contract's going to hit, when they're going to peak as a professional. Some teams put more value into the age game than other teams. Yep. But Kenny Clark, I think, is a really good case study for that working out and really getting the best of that player as they hit that 21, 22-year-old stride and their body starts to fill out.
All right, let's get to days 2 and 3 here. And what we're going to do is we're going to go round by round here. And we're going to spend just a little bit of time kind of going through a few categories, just kind of looking at this draft. And we're going to go each round. Each of us will pick a player for each of the following categories. We'll name the best pick, you know, the pick that worked out best for that team 4 years after the fact, our biggest hit. So based off our personal evaluations, my evaluation and your evaluation, the player that we felt like we nailed, you know, it could be from a positive standpoint. Hey, we really thought this guy was going to be a good player and he really worked out. Or from a negative standpoint, hey, I had my questions about this guy and he didn't quite work out. Our swing and a miss. So a player that we loved that did not reach that expectation, an overachiever, a player that I had questions about and surpassed those expectations. And then lastly, just kind of a parting thought. We might have one, we might have not, you know, just looking at the players that were selected in any given round. I think we're going to have some fun conversations here as we get through the rest of this draft. Let's go with round 2, and I'll let you kick things off. Who's the best pick in your mind in round 2 of the 2016 draft?
Well, in round 2, there's a lot of good players here, a lot of diversity in players, but I'm going to go with the middle round 2 and Deion Jones there for the Atlanta Falcons. We saw him play in a Super Bowl. It's kind of been a mainstay linebacker since day one. Actually got their other linebacker later in this draft in Devondre Campbell, who could be one of those superlatives for us here, I think in round 4 or 5 there coming out of the University of Minnesota. But Deion Jones, I think, was just exactly what everybody has looked for at that linebacker position since. Explosive player, athletic player, a 3-down linebacker that can make plays in every facet of the game. And while he has that same type of athleticism as a Darren Lee, Deion Jones played that more traditional will linebacker position coming out of LSU next to Quan Alexander, whoever he played with at LSU, but much more a NFL ready prospect for what he was asked to do at LSU, in my opinion.
Yeah, for me, I went with Derrick Henry, who obviously, look, he was a second round pick. He won the Heisman, I believe, right the year before. Was a first team All American. When I looked at Derrick Henry, I could have very easily used him as my overachiever because I had major questions about him, man. Like just kind of going through my final summary on him, I thought he was a bigger back that may have some stretches of success in the NFL, but I didn't see him as a long-time effective starter. I wrote, to me, Henry is a change of pace, short yardage back. I wrote down LeGarrette Blount as a potential comparison. And I said could fill in either in any scheme, zone or gap blocking scheme, and fit in as a starter, maybe better in a zone scheme with a plus offensive line. So to me, like, Henry has turned into obviously one of the better backs in the NFL. He was a foundation piece for a team that went to the AFC title game last year. The offense funneled through him. We'll see if he can continue that success, but it has certainly found a home in that Tennessee offense and has turned into a really, really good, again, a foundation piece for that scheme. So we'll see if he can continue to mount on that here in 2020. I don't know. Where did you fall on Derrick Henry when it's all said and done? I don't even know if you're going to talk about him here coming up.
He was a tough one for me because he was that big bruiser back that, that Brandon Jacobs style, that LeGarrette Blount style that I don't traditionally like. I want someone with a little more versatility, two-way ability, especially in the pass game. But he was one of those players that was productive in high school, productive at a high level in Alabama, won the Heisman Trophy, won national championships. He's just one of those guys that, don't overthink it. And he may not look like the traditional running back, being that 6'2", 6'3" frame. He's a little bit different in his style. But, man, he just did nothing but show up every time he needed to when on the football field. I think sometimes you overthink players like that. Maybe you saw a TJ Yeldon next to him and got a little more excited, for his NFL ability. Or maybe even that guy that barely touched the ball in Kenyon Drake.
Yep.
Who is a really interesting case study as well. So I think you saw some of that juice around Derrick Henry and said, I think those other guys are really what you want there. Is this a Mikel LaShore 2.0 type of player coming out of Illinois that the Detroit Lions thought was going to be that big bruiser back for him that never really panned out? So I like Derrick Henry. I probably overthought it just a bit, in my opinion.
How do you feel that he compares to a pick that was, it was made in the third round? It was, kind of questioned by people, or a second round, I should say. A.J. Dillon, coming out of Boston College and going to the Green Bay Packers. Because Dillon, I think, has some similarities for sure in terms of size and play style.
Yeah, I think a lot of people in the Packers community are kind of pointing to the Derrick Henry situation as a don't overthink this bell cow back, that played from a pro-style offense in Boston College. Didn't show you a lot in the pass game, but maybe he can contribute a little bit more in the screen game and things like that than we saw on Saturdays. So Derrick Henry is kind of that case study that Packers fans are hoping for to be that thunder and lightning maybe next to Aaron Jones.
All right, let's get to the guys that we felt was our biggest hits. Who do you feel was your biggest hit in this draft?
So now, biggest hit. This is a guy I had to be high on in the evaluation. And then he's also panned out. So there's a couple guys that I think fit this narrative that I could have picked in this conversation. I was a huge Sterling Shepard fan. I thought this guy won in every facet of receiver play, especially for his size. Kind of an undersized player. We knew he's going to be a slot player in the NFL. But at Oklahoma, he made plays down the field, on the ball, outside the numbers, over the middle of the field, red zone. But I'm actually going to curveball you here just a little bit, Fran, because I love Jerron Reed coming out of Alabama. And he's one of these guys that did not get the opportunity to go up the field at Alabama. He's a run-plugging, two-gapping, line of scrimmage dweller at Alabama. That's what he had to do. That's what he was asked to do and did it very, very well. The Seahawks end up taking him, and 2 years into his NFL career, he falls into an 11-sack season. So there's a big conversation as well for the draft and saying, you know what? They weren't asked to do it on Saturdays. That doesn't necessarily mean they can't do it. And I think he's one of these players to say, you know what? I know he can play the run well. He's going to show up with a good base, good pad level, good hand placement, good leverage at the point of attack. And yeah, we could find a spot for him on third down if he could get up the field. And I think he's surprised everybody with his ability on third down.
So I'm going to take two W's here on this one. And two of the guys that I was really, kind of pounding the table for throughout the pre-draft process. One was at corner, and that was Xavier Howard coming out of Baylor. He was actually been my number 2 corner coming out. I had him ahead of Eli Apple, who went top 10. I had him ahead of Vernon Hargreaves, who went top 15. I had him ahead of Kendall Fuller, who a lot of people really like. I loved Xavier Howard. I had him behind Jalen Ramsey, and I wrote that Howard, looks like a plug-and-play option on the outside. He's got size, quickness, the competitiveness, the instincts. I loved his ball skills. I thought his ball skills were some of the best in the class. I wanted to see a little bit more consistent technique, but I thought he was a quality, long-time starter in the NFL. So that for sure would be my biggest W, I think, when it comes to second round and really overall in this draft. But the other big one for me, and to me, was Tyler Boyd. I was a big fan of Tyler Boyd. I had him actually as my number one receiver overall in this class. I had him ahead of Coleman. I had him ahead of Josh Doxson, ahead of Laquan Treadwell, ahead of Malcolm Mitchell, Sterling Shepard, a bunch of those guys. I looked at Tyler Boyd, and he hasn't quite reached the expectations that I had for him coming out. Like, I really liked him, but he's turned into a more productive player than Coleman, Doxson, Treadwell, a bunch of those guys. I think that when you looked at Boyd, his ability to separate and his ball skills, to me, were the things that really flashed to me. For him to go second round, I know he didn't test well, and that's really the big thing that kind of kept him from going in round one. But with both of these guys, really, and I think with both positions, it's so important. Competitiveness and ball skills. Like, if you show me a receiver with competitiveness and ball skills, we're cooking. You show me a corner with competitiveness and ball skills, we are really cooking. Like, we're off and running. And to me, like, I looked at Xavier Howard and compared him to those other guys. Like, again, a guy who's over 6 foot, who's over 200 pounds, had his best football ahead of him. He was a high school quarterback who had never played in the secondary until he got to college. Like, I thought his best football was ahead of him. He tested well. He ran low 4.4s. I just thought, to me, like Xavier Howard, especially when you looked at his ability to find the ball late down the field. It wasn't necessarily all about his ball production, even though that was there. It was more just the traits that he showed in reaching that production. That was what really just had me excited about his film. So to me, those would be my two biggest W's coming out of round two.
And Fran, really quick before we move on to some of our misses and overachievers, I'm going to put you on the spot here just a little bit.
Okay,
so when you're going with your biggest hit, you could also have a big hit here by being down on a player.
Yes.
That got drafted high and that didn't pan out. So keep that in mind here, because there's two guys in round two that got taken coincidentally from the same college team that I was way down on, that I did not have even second round grades on. Two of them got taken in the second round. One's no longer in the NFL, and Kevin Dodd out of Clemson. And the other is Mackenzie Alexander out of Clemson, that I saw tons of technique issues with coming out of the ACC there. Obviously, they had won the national championship beating Alabama. But I thought he had a lot of technique flaws and has really struggled to get on the field at Minnesota Vikings. I think he actually just left in free agency. But there are two players there that I kind of pat myself on the back, that I thought what I saw on the tape on Saturdays really translated to what I saw on Sundays and on the practice field for their respective NFL teams.
I actually missed on both those guys. I really liked Mackenzie Alexander. I think he only had one interception in his career, if I remember right.
Correct,
I remember the production was really low. And with Dodd, he only had 1 year of production. He had like 12 and a half sacks or something like that in his final year on campus. And that was his only year as a starter. I really liked him, though. I think that he was long. I thought he was pretty fluid. He just didn't know what he was doing yet as a pass rusher. Like, it was still kind of coming along, but I thought he was a good run defender that could kind of grow. But, I think that there were, again, another one of these guys where I think there was some off-field stuff that kind of, led to him. I think by year two, he was off that team, right? I don't think he made it out of his second camp down there in Tennessee. No, that's a good point, and that some of these we'll talk about were some of the ones that we didn't have high expectations for, that didn't necessarily miss. Let's go to the swing and the miss here. Who was a guy that you really liked that didn't work out?
So this is a guy, we're going to go back to kind of the Packers conversation here. They traded up in round two for tackle Jason Spriggs. So anytime you see that trade up value, you're expecting to get an impact player. If not in year one, most definitely in year two. Now, they already had Bakhtiari, they had Bulaga, so this is really more of an insurance policy tackle piece. I thought I saw a really good, strong player, athletic player at the University of Indiana that rarely ever got beat until he showed up to the Senior Bowl and had much higher level of competition, struggled repeatedly with inside moves. And Mike Mayock made me put inside moves on his XO for the draft coverage, and I didn't necessarily understand why until I talked to Big Duke Manyweather. And that's when he says, listen, Spriggs is a really good player, very athletic, but he has technique flaws. He has movement pattern flaws. And I'm like, what do you mean? And he says, watch his hips. He'll turn his hips unnaturally to the sideline immediately. So the second you turn to the sideline it's almost impossible to recover for inside moves. And you saw that time and time again at the Senior Bowl, time and time again in the NFL. And that's really why he has struggled in his brief career in the NFL. And the Packers really couldn't find a spot for him to get on the field. And he's since taken a free agent deal on his way out of town with the Chicago Bears. But he was a player that, trading up for in the second round, I know their expectations were much, much higher than what they got. But it's figuring out, what did you see on tape at Indiana? What was the issue and why did it not translate? And I think you really have to put some of these guys under that microscope and put them in the lab and say, what went wrong? What did I not see? Because I thought he was a really good player at Indiana, but how much was he just getting by being bigger, stronger, more athletic than everybody else, and where the technique starts to catch up with you? And that's the same thing with Mackenzie Alexander. When you start breaking him down by a down basis, I see a guy that struggled to transition, very grabby at the top of routes. And that stuff starts to compound once you get into Sundays and against NFL players. And if your technique is not polished, it's going to catch up with you at some point if you're not willing to change.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, I was high on Spriggs as well, and obviously has not worked out and has not panned out to the pre-draft.
But Fran, the interesting thing with that is they gave us no reason on that Saturday tape to think there's going to be any sort of issues. And I think figuring out who's just getting by with God-given abilities or being better than the other guy, I think is why we tend to overthink some of the FCS players and just saying, are they just playing big boy ball and they're a higher class of player than all these guys around them? And we tend to overthink some of those scenarios. And then sometimes on these, FBS Power 5 players, we tend to give them the benefit of the doubt. And I think there's interesting kind of case studies and examples for success and failures both ways.
A few weeks ago on the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast, Fueled by Gatorade, I talked about just my evolution in terms of how I evaluate quarterbacks, and I learn it. I learned to talk about what strengths I value and what weaknesses I'm willing and not willing to overlook. One of my biggest case studies that I can point to and say, this was a learning situation for me was Christian Hackenberg, where I really had to kind of dig in here, Ben. I was absolutely the odd man out. Everybody else in the media was out on Christian Hackenberg, but I watched, and obviously, look, the accuracy was not good, right? He had some really bad misses on tape. I kind of chalked that up to bad lower body mechanics. The scheme wasn't ideal for him. He's not like that catch, point, and shoot kind of quarterback. He needed to be more, under center, play action, define things well for him. I didn't quite see that scheme fit being great for him. And I thought, you know what, look, I saw the flashes of him working in the pocket. You saw the poise, the toughness. Obviously, the arm strength was there, but his ability to make those tight window throws. And I said, you know what, this guy can make plays from the pocket consistently. This was like when my mind started to kind of turn back and kind of get back the other way in terms of what I look for at the quarterback position. Obviously, Christian Hackenberg has not worked out, and as our local affiliate NBC 10 has pointed out this offseason, he is now turning his attention to a baseball career. So, the Christian Hackenberg certainly did not work out in the NFL, did not live up to what my expectations were of him coming in. Certainly a huge, huge learning point for me when evaluating quarterbacks. And a few things there, right? There's the ability to create, which he did not have, right? Because to me, when you're talking about quarterbacks, you've got to be able to get yourself out of trouble. If you can't do it with your mind, which most rookies can, if you can't do it, pre-snap and kind of get yourself out of trouble that way, then you've got to be able to do it with your legs. That's just a fact of today's NFL. You've got to be able to get out of trouble that way. And then accuracy and ball placement, like how much of that is fixable and how much of it is not. With Christian Hackenberg, he was really never able to kind of shake those issues that he had from a ball placement standpoint in college.
But Fran, the interesting thing is, and I think what was making him such a polarizing prospect is, we saw such strong QB play that first year at Penn State under Bill O'Brien. Then the coaching staff changed, and that was kind of the benefit of the doubt to say, you know what? The new coaching staff didn't do him any favors. He needs to be in this scheme. And now looking back at saying, I think Bill O'Brien just did a heck of a job with this kid. What was the issue so much from that first year into his second and third year at Penn State that we just never saw that same player? I think he drafted in the second round based off of that first year kind of expectation and aesthetics coming out of Penn State, which we were all impressed. Everybody after that first year thought we're looking at a top first half of round one all day long.
Yeah, to me, I just wrote down my summary for him. With patience and correct coaching, I think Hackenberg has starting quality traits in the NFL. You got to worry about the long stretches of erratic play in college, but and he needs a lot of work. But there's talent and pro style traits there. He's not ready now, but I think he can be a quality starter down the road. He was my third quarterback. He was behind Wentz and Goff for me. I had him ahead of Paxton Lynch and a bunch of the other guys that we've talked about already. I was higher on Hackenberg than most, but the production obviously was not what you wanted. A very low touchdown interception ratio. A lot of the things that you point to from a number standpoint certainly were not there. I was kind of banking on traits and what we saw throughout, early in his career more often, but then the flashes as well. That's kind of what I was banking on. But
and I don't want to put too much emphasis on the off-field workouts and stuff, but he did some things at the pro day that I've never seen before, Fran. He was missing running backs like in the flat, which I have almost never seen from any quarterbacks, even those quarterbacks that turn into tight ends in day one. Typically are hitting those running backs in the flat in pro days to their own running backs. And I remember one of those plays putting into his XO for Mayock because it was such a glaring miss. And I think looking at that, you could put a lot of value in those pro days, but I think that was kind of a bigger thread to pull to that sweater of some issues with his accuracy and mechanics.
So let's go with our the guy that we felt was our overachiever, a guy that maybe we had some questions about, we weren't quite as high on, but certainly has surpassed the pre-draft expectation. For me, this one's easy, man. And I took a W for Tyler Boyd earlier, and I talked about and I had him ahead of Laquan Treadwell, and I had him ahead of this guy and that guy and Doxson and Coleman. I had him ahead of Michael Thomas too, man. Michael Thomas has turned into obviously one of the most productive players in the National Football League. A lot of that does have to do with scheme, and we can talk about that as well. But I think when you look at Thomas, I had some questions overall about just, his ability to kind of translate. I thought we saw flashes, with his route running ability, his ability to separate. I'll just kind of read you what I wrote down here. I said he's probably a better fit at X than Z for an NFL team. He's got flashes, but I've got some questions about his hands and ultimate athleticism. I think he has the potential to be a solid possession receiver at the next level, probably nothing more than that. And I would say that there is a little bit of bust factor. I wrote down two comparisons. I wrote down a cross of Dwayne Bowe and Nelson Aguilar, which is kind of an interesting little comparison, in terms of like two guys with different skill sets. But I had some questions overall about his movement, his ability to win one-on-one. Obviously, look at it. He spends a lot of time in the slot for that reason. But I had some questions about Michael Thomas, and he has certainly surpassed that, man.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a home run selection there in the second round with his production with the New Orleans Saints and Drew Brees. And I remember Urban saying to Mayock, man, they got a really good player. This is one of the most competitive SOBs I've ever coached. This guy will fight in practice on nearly every practice session. And he wasn't saying that as a feisty type of head case player, but more of just a competitive nature and never backing down, especially when you get some of those corners they get out there in Ohio State. There was some very, very interesting battles between him and guys like Marshawn Lattimore and Denzel Ward and the who's who of corners. But as much as you're saying this was an easy pick, I thought it was an easy pick the other way, because you're looking at what Chris Jones has done for the Kansas City Chiefs coming out of Mississippi State. This is the poster child for overachieving draft pick in the second round, because I did not see this style of player at Mississippi State.
Agreed, yep.
As a 3-year player, 8.5 sacks total in his career. I think he had 3 his first year, 3 the second, and then that junior year, 2.5 with 7.5 TFLs. I mean, you're getting to guys now, the who's who of the drafts, with 20 sacks and 30 TFLs in a one given college season for the top of the top players. So we did not see this style of player. We saw a player that would occasionally take plays off, maybe didn't always look like he was playing intense on a down-to-down basis, had some flashes of excellence in that 6'6", 300-pound frame down there in the SEC. But I did not see the type of instant disruptor and the pass rusher that we've seen with the Chiefs. And this guy, I put on Twitter, I think the end of the 2018 season leading into 2019, the most disruptive defensive player in the NFL. Not the best pass rusher, but the most disruptive. And I have to say disruptive because he gets his hands up in so many passing lanes. He is so big, so much of a nuisance. He's that 7'2" center you put on the inbounder that you just cannot throw around. He wins with power, wins with speed, good run defender. And you look at that 2018 season, 16 sacks as a trench player, as dominant as any interior defensive lineman, DeForest Buckner, Aaron Donald included. So I think he's kind of the poster child here for overachiever.
To me, like, and I mentioned all those defensive tackles early in the draft. I had Chris Jones below a lot of those guys. And to me, like, my big thing that I got hung up on with Chris Jones was the inconsistent motor. Like, I didn't see the level of urgency, the level of violence and competitiveness that I wanted to see. And to me, like we talk about like learning points and takeaways, it was him and Kawan Short that I think of in this instance. So often with defensive linemen, when they're playing at the college level, they're playing 85 snaps a game, 82 snaps a game, 78 snaps a game. When they get to the NFL, they're playing 58 snaps a game. They're playing 48 snaps a game. Their snap counts are going to go down because in the NFL, you're going to be playing a little bit more of a rotation. There's a little bit more versatility in terms of the defensive fronts and the packages and things like that. So don't get hung up on the defensive line with a lack of motor, because that can speak to something more. And again, that goes to understanding the whole picture and what the kid's makeup is. But that's not going to be everything. If he checks other boxes in terms of the off field and the motor is the only question with a defensive lineman, you say, all right, well, he's probably not going to be playing every single down when he comes to the NFL anyway. So let's anticipate that his conditioning is going to be a little bit better late in games once he gets to the NFL. And I think Chris Jones is kind of a poster child for that in my mind, along with Kawan Short for the Carolina Panthers.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought there was just a safer player. I liked it in Adolphus Washington more out of Ohio State if they wanted a up-the-field defensive tackle, or even a Jonathan Bullard I thought was maybe a safer pick coming out of Florida there. A lot.
Yep.
You could even go a little bit later that I thought Chris Jones was more in that back end of day 3 Quentin Jefferson mold of a unknown kind of a project player. But he's obviously lived up to the bill, being the 37th overall player and being taken above all those Alabama players. A'Shawn Robinson, Jerron Reed, Malik Collins coming out of Nebraska was an exciting player as well. So I think Chris Jones has more than exceeded his draft slot. And then looking at the D tackles in front of him, Vernon Butler, Robert Kimdiche, those are some guys that he probably warranted being drafted over them as well.
So just a parting thought for me, just looking at some of the other guys who were drafted in round 2. I think you got to, this goes to an earlier discussion what you brought up with those halfway players. You got to have a plan for some of these guys that we're seeing as like positionless players at linebacker or safety. Like, what are they? A few of those guys in here, like Miles Jack, he fell to round 2 because of the injury concerns, but hasn't quite lived up to the billing that he had, right, coming out of UCLA. Sua Cravens was a second-round pick out of USC. Kamalai Correa, a second-round pick out of Boise State. All these guys, it was like, all right, well, is he a linebacker? Is he a safety? Is he an edge guy? Like, what does he bring to the table? I think you have to have plans for those guys. And Kamalai Correa ends up going to a second team, and it looks like he's kind of found a home. You have to have a plan for these guys, to have that versatile skill set. That's my big takeaway here from round 2.
Yeah, mine kind of bleeds into that as well. And just kind of when can you pull the trigger on some guys with the injury backgrounds, whether that's a Miles Jack or even a Jalen Smith, who did everything right on the field, off the field, but just one monster injury in his last college game. And I think the Cowboys did the right thing and taking a player that warranted that draft spot and having some foresight and some kind of long-term thinking. And I think they've been more than happy with that selection there at linebacker and pairing him with Sean Lee and then later Leighton Vander Esch. But, that's always a tough conversation every year to say, he showed us everything right. Where do you take that player? And I think the Philadelphia Eagles got into a similar situation with that, with Sidney Jones a couple years later. Everything right on the field, off the field, just dealing with the injury. And sometimes that injury can set a player's career back. Sometimes it motivates them moving forward. There's obviously no mold to that, but just that conversation every year on where you select those players with the injury background or a current injury is a deep, deep conversation.
Jalen Smith, I think my second highest graded linebacker I've ever studied on the film coming out of college, only behind Reuben Foster.
And Fran, there's so many interesting conversations in this draft. It's like the whole cat and mouse on when do you take a kicker? And then this is the Roberto Aguayo second-round pick. If they got a Sebastian Janikowski and a 15-year kicker, that's a home run pick in year 15. It may take 15 years for you to accept that. And then sometimes you get a young kid who gets the yips and sheesh, you gotta cut bait. So, it's a weird thing to say that kicker, if it panned out to be a 10-year kicker, that's a home run pick, but you almost have to wait 10 years to figure that out.
I think I'm going to
And
let.
that's
I think I'm always going to let somebody else take that chance. That's just my. That's just my.
I think I'm in that camp as well.
All right, let's get to round three. The best pick to me, it's Yannick Ngakoue coming out of Maryland. I liked Yannick Ngakoue's film. I'm going to go back really quick, pull up my summary on him. I liked his film. There were certainly some questions about him in terms of his ability to reach that upside, but he was a little bit on the undersized side. Didn't have the longest arms in the world. Underdeveloped pass rusher who wins more with his feet than he does with his hands at this stage of his development. But he's got the talent to turn into a starting defensive end, preferably in a one-gap scheme. Solid athlete, but's got to get stronger and more refined. Can be a sub-package rusher right away, but in a reserve role. So, I kind of felt that Ngakoue had that starting potential, but he's turned into a really, really talented. One of the few guys, as you mentioned earlier, that you would say is like a quality starting edge rusher who wins primarily with speed. He's got a little bit of power and he can win low side as well, but more often than not, he's turning the corner on guys.
Yeah, and there's a player in this class, Fran, I overthought. Number one, where he played at school, and then his body type. And that's Javon Hargrave coming out of South Carolina State. But going back, and now that he's a Philadelphia Eagle and seeing what he's done, and it's really impressive 4 years with the Pittsburgh Steelers, I go back to my notes, say potentially the most explosive interior player in this class. Incredible burst off the snap, great one-step disruption. And I see some of these notes, and then I just see, well, he's a bit undersized, a bit unconventional frame for a trench player, played at a smaller school competition concerns. And just so you know what? It's all the aesthetic stuff. And it's if it's just the size-based things and the logo on the helmets, these are the scouting lessons that you have to go back and go through. And this draft has a bunch of those. And whether it's looking at a Vernon Butler out of La Tech, Noah Spence out of Eastern Kentucky, the way James Bradbury's turned into his career out of Stanford, and Carson Wentz being the second overall draft.
Yep.
The small school guys, the FCS guys, I don't want to call them small school because some of these schools are big, big programs with a lot of kids and some really good history, but not the Power 5 schools, kind of what I'm saying.
Scout the player, not the helmet.
Javon Hargrave is, case example one to say what he's done at South Carolina State and in the NFL, I think has really warranted that draft spot.
Yeah, there are a bunch of guys in this class that really found a lot of success, from the outside of the Power 5 for sure. Let's go to the biggest hit. For me, it was my number 2 safety in this class, a guy that I was really, really high on, Kevin Byard, Middle Tennessee State. You talk about those small school guys. Like I've really liked Kevin Byard. And again, just going back to what we talked about earlier with Keanu Neal, right? Like translatable traits. Like, all right, what does he do in college? Is that going to be what he's asked to do in the NFL? And I wrote down for Byard, really fun safety to watch, one that may not always look like it, but I think he's going to be an NFL starter, most effective in a system that will employ 2 high safeties. I did question whether or not he would be a great post player, but I thought that he would run the alley really well, really strong run defender. He played the ball extremely well in the air. He had great ball skills. I just had questions of, all right, is he a plus athlete? Is he a great top-end player in the open field? But man, like I really like the way that Kevin Byard played and has turned into a really, really good player for the Tennessee Titans for sure.
So my pick for this biggest hit, in my opinion, was a guy that you just saw flashes of in college. But every time he flashed, he just was doing the right thing and making big plays. But he just always was stuck from a crowded backfield perspective. And that's Kenyon Drake at Alabama. And I love the way he's been used in the NFL, both with the Miami Dolphins and since with the Arizona Cardinals being traded last year. And I think he's kind of one of the reasons why they had no problem saying goodbye to David Johnson in a trade this offseason. I'm pretty sure Kenyon Drake's still in the Cardinals.
Yes,
I'm just checking here for a second. But his opportunity and what he can do in the pass game. But you look at his careers at Alabama, stuck with TJ Yeldon and Derrick Henry. Even coming in as a freshman, he was stuck behind bell cow Eddie Lacy. So they've always had somebody else with him in combination, splitting carries, never had more than 90, rushes in a season. But every time he had the ball, he was making big plays, big yards after catch in the pass game and the screen game, good in the open field, pretty good runner between the tackles and out on the perimeter. And then there's just figuring out where that warranted the draft selection. I think the 3rd round was kind of that right spot for him for what he can do and just being a little bit more of a 3rd down back with the potential of being an every down number 1 back for a team.
I think the running back position is just so interesting when you talk about like evaluation and valuation, like trying to figure out like how these guys can be used and how important that is to a team, how easy it is to find that kind of player. It's such a fascinating discussion because there were a handful of guys in this class that I thought had a similar skill set. Like Tyler Irvin, I was really high on coming out of San Jose State. He didn't quite work out with the Houston Texans, but that's a really good one here. Who's your swing and a miss player from this round?
Oh, my swing and a miss player here is going to be a guy that looked the part and I thought had all the tools, but again, had some technique flaws. And that's Raven Clark, the left tackle out of Texas Tech. Long arms, big frame, but had the waist bending tendency, the reaching tendency, would get himself off balance quite a bit. But he was a guy that you saw in shorts and a t-shirt and that arm length at the combine. And I'm pretty sure he played at the Senior Bowl as well, had a pretty good week down there, but just had some technique flaws, and I just don't think was ever able to really master and lock down one of those offensive line spots for the Colts there, being a third-round pick, 82 overall.
Yeah, mine was Jonathan Bullard. We've mentioned him a couple times already. To me, like really strong, technically sound run defender, especially playing at defensive end because he kind of was one of those guys that played defensive end and run downs and then slid inside as a three technique on passing downs. And I kind of felt that would be the role that he could find in the NFL. It seems like he's more sticking to kind of being a base player, and not really impacting the quarterback as well, which was a little bit surprising to me. He wasn't like this super athletic interior disruptor. Even, look, he ran 4.8 at 285. Like, he's got some movement ability. Yeah, I just wanted to see him come along a little bit better in terms of his rush skill, but the potential was there. Tough physical kid. I thought that Bullard would turn into a really good player, and he did not for the Chicago Bears. Let's go to overachiever here. Mine was Austin Hooper, man. I was not a big Austin Hooper guy. I remember actually going back and forth with Matt Waldman, who does a great job covering the draft and with player evaluation. And he and I saw Hooper he loved Austin Hooper. I did not love Austin Hooper. He's turned into a nice player. I thought that teams would need to be patient. I thought he was a solid athlete. He had the ability to get down the seam. I just had overall questions on what's this level of competitiveness? Is he going to be a guy that's going to be a true matchup guy? Like, I didn't think he was like that dynamic of an athlete. I'll tell you, man, he's turned into a nice player, and I thought he needed to come along as a blocker as well, but he's turned into a 3-down player previously with the Atlanta Falcons, and I think obviously he's got the ability to be a very productive player. Where is he now in Cleveland? So we'll see. But Austin Hooper, to me, was the guy that certainly superseded my expectations of him going into the draft.
All right, so I was kind of straddling two players here, and I really love what the Eagles have gotten out of Isaac Seumalo coming out of Oregon State in that third round. And for only being really a one-year starter in 2019, kind of went back and forth in 2018 at that left guard spot. But his ability to contribute up and down the offensive line at tackle, guard, center, swing tackle, fullback, I just think he's really overachieved that draft spot and has been a good depth piece and chess piece. But we'd be remiss not to mention Jacoby Brissett coming at NC State here as an overachiever, being the Florida transfer. And then going back to my notes on Jacoby Brissett, big body guy, strong arm, surprisingly athletic, inside the pocket, outside the pocket, tough on quarterback runs. His ability to anticipate throwing windows and throwing receivers open, I thought was elite coming out of NC State. And that's something you don't see on Saturdays very often. And typically something that translates to the NFL extremely well is the ability to anticipate and knowing where to go with the football. This is a guy that protected the ball extremely well, only 6 interceptions in that last season in 2015. So he was a guy that was responsible with the ball, big-bodied kid, played in the SEC, played in the ACC, and I thought just had all the tools and just had to figure out where was he on the pecking order of quarterbacks in this class. Maybe didn't have the upside that people thought a Hackenberg or a Paxton Lynch was showing him. But this is a player you just can't overthink a player like this. And I think what we've seen from him in the NFL of being that consummate professional, that ready to go back up at any instance, whether it's for the Patriots or the Colts at the last minute with Andrew Luck retiring a week before the season. I just think he's been a great home run, overachieving pick there as a third rounder.
You kind of stole the words right out of my mouth. For my parting thought, you mentioned Seumalo, and I would put him in this boat. I would put Joe Thuney in this boat from the New England Patriots. Like, versatility is such an important trait for young offensive linemen, especially when you're talking like middle rounds and late rounds, because we talk about this from a team building standpoint when we get to roster cut downs in late August, right? It's like, okay, how are you going to cut down your roster from 90 to 53? Who's going to fill up those back end spots on the offensive line? You need guys that can be swing tackles, who can be a tackle guard, who can be a guard center. So when you have those guys that can be chess pieces along the offensive line and play a number of different roles, and at the drop of a hat, come in and play center or come in and play right tackle. Sayamalu played what? He played 4 of the 5 offensive line spots in his rookie season. Joe Tooney played, I think, all 5 offensive line positions during his career at NC State. He played a bunch of them when he was down there with the Wolfpack. I think when you have those young guys, yeah, at some point they're going to settle in. You want them to be a starter if you're taking them in round 3, right? You want them to be a starter at some point. But in the meantime, having that versatility is just so, so important when you're talking about it, having that value early on in your career as you develop into a starter.
Yeah, Fran, and just some of those picks, I just think they're funny at the time because they're not the sexy pick. They're not that exciting running back or that speedy receiver, maybe that situational edge rusher that you're going to see and make big plays. And these entrenched players, especially on the offensive line, just aren't the sexy picks. And I'm going to leapfrog a couple rounds here, but Isaac Seumalo really represents them. But you look back in a Austin Blythe at Iowa, Ted Karras coming out of Illinois, being the Patriots pick later in the draft. Wes Schweitzer from San Jose State has played a lot of good ball for the Atlanta Falcons. I promise you, the fans kind of sat back in their chair with their arms up during every one of those picks, saying, oh, we could have had so-and-so skill player. But these are important depth pieces, particularly on the offensive line. And all 4 of those players, Schweitzer, Karras, Blythe, Isaac Seumalo, are absolute home run picks by each of their teams.
No question. Well, let's go to round 4, man. Who was the best pick in your mind from the 4th round of this draft?
Well, I have to go with Dak Prescott here, coming out of Mississippi State. And I think that's kind of an easy pick, and he was the one that was easy to overthink. He won a lot of games, a really clutch player at Mississippi State for Dan Mullen out there, played a lot of big games, won a lot of games in the 4th quarter, not only with his arm, with his legs, but you saw all the leadership and the competitive fire at the quarterback position in the SEC. Man, he was a guy that had a lot of tools, and it was a little bit raw with just his throwing ability and kind of NFL route trees and things like that in that offense down there that was really catered to his skill set, which at the end of the day was really a Tim Tebow style of offense that Dan Mullen was running for him, much more of a quarterback run focus. But, the Cowboys took Zeke Elliott in the early 1st round with that great offensive line, and that was always going to be the foundation. I think that's a great situation for any quarterback to walk into, to say, you know what, we're going to lean on the run game. We have a strong offensive line. I don't have to go out and win games all the time. It's my job to hand the ball off and not lose games. And I think Dak really massaged his way into a comfortable starting quarterback in the league with that mentality.
Just going back to my summary of him, like I was lower on Prescott. I spent some time with him before the draft because he was down at the Senior Bowl and obviously at the Combine. Really impressed with him from a personality standpoint. And I think, watching him on film, I wrote that, look, I think he's come a long way in some area of his game. He's got natural tools, big, strong kid. He throws it well. He's athletic. The issue ultimately comes down to the fact that he holds on to the ball entirely too long in the pocket. He took a lot of unnecessary hits. He leaves a lot of plays on the field. Plus, his ball placement was average at best, in my opinion. So I thought he needed to throw with better touch. I thought he needed to refine his lower body mechanics. I wrote down not ready to play, needs a lot of work. There's so much for that one. Throw that one out into the garbage can because he comes out as a rookie and obviously played good football for the Dallas Cowboys. To me, and that goes back to what we talked about earlier with Hackenberg. That ability to create is big. You need the off field, especially the quarterback position, is certainly big. You need the team to be able to believe in you, and you need the mental capacity to be able to take on the entire playbook. But I think you're exactly right. From a team building philosophy, if you're going to start a young quarterback, especially a guy that still needs to come along in certain areas, having those other pieces in place as well as the game plan in place, that, hey, we're not going to lean on this guy, certainly goes a long way. Certainly the best pick of round 4. To me, I'll just throw in Tavion Young real quick. Temple made, comes in, who was a day 1 nickel for the Baltimore Ravens. I think when you get to day 3, there's certainly a certain strategy that you're looking for, and Tavion Young certainly came in. He's battled some injuries over the course of his career, but ended up being a really rock-solid player for the Baltimore Ravens. Who was your biggest hit in this round in 2016 in round 4.
Coincidentally, just another guy that's fallen his way to the Philadelphia Eagles, and that's Texas defensive tackle Hassan Ridgeway. And you look back at that Texas team, Jordan Hicks, Malcolm Brown, Quandre Diggs, Hassan Ridgeway, a lot of good players on an underachieving Texas Longhorn team there under Charlie Strong, where they really kind of struggled to hit their stride in the win department. But he was recruiting a lot of big-time players every year to that program. And I just go back to my notes of Hassan Ridgeway and immediately just go into the negatives. Injury-plagued career, questionable conditioning and effort issues at times, positional fit. But when he was on the field, he did everything right. And what I'm getting at with the negatives is they're all those kind of off the field and the aesthetic stuff, not between the lines and between the whistle on a down-to-down basis. Was a bit of a rotational player, played a variety of spots there on the Texas defensive line. And it's just one of these players that's really tough to evaluate on a struggling team collectively. But like I had mentioned, there's a lot of talented players. And when you watched him in a vacuum, he was a productive player against the run and the pass, a strong player, had counter moves against the pass, and can play with a variety of spots. So there was a lot to like. And I think immediately he went to the Indianapolis Colts. And I think they were more than pleased with what they got in the third round there.
It's
fourth round, excuse me.
Yeah, but I'm glad that you brought him up because I actually had him a couple slots ahead of the guy that I wanted to bring up here, who was Andrew Billings. And again, Andrew Billings was in a lot of mock drafts as a first-round pick, especially throughout the course of the fall and then early part of the offseason. Thought he moved down a little bit as we got closer to the draft, but ended up being a fourth-round pick. And I wrote down, look, he's what you draw up as a nose tackle. You want him to look like this with his superior strength, a wide base, his ability to hold up well at the point of attack. He'll need to improve his hand usage. He won't get by with what he's working with at the NFL level. And I've questioned his third down value. To me, that was the biggest thing is like, I'm not going to just take an early downs player in round 1. I need the guy to be able to offer some third down juice. And I thought Hassan Ridgeway certainly did. I had questions about Billings. And I know he came on late in his career in Cincinnati. He's now in Cleveland. The Bengals ended up letting him go this offseason. But I had questions about Billings, and I think that those questions, I think, were valid at this point. Now we could say 4 years later. Let's go to the swing and a miss. For me, this one's easy, man. Like, I loved Kenneth Dixon coming out of Louisiana Tech, man. Like, loved Kenneth Dixon as a I thought he was a 3-down back. Let me pull up. I think I had an interesting player comp for him. Yeah, I wrote down T.J. Yeldon, who I also loved, and T.J. Yeldon didn't work out either. So maybe I need to throw that comp out. But Kenneth Dixon, to me, like ultra competitive runner, good athleticism, a mean streak, was productive. He offered great value as a receiver. I thought that he could be a feature back at the next level. Kind of a rich man's James Starks was another thing I wrote down about Kenneth Dixon. I really, really liked Kenneth Dixon, and he has not worked out for sure. I think he's now with the New York Jets as a backup up there in New York.
Yeah, so my biggest miss is going to be Connor Cook at quarterback, who I thought had a lot of tools coming out of Michigan State. In his 3 years as a starter, I mean, he went 13-1, 11-2, 12-2. And his last game was this Cotton Bowl game I was at against Baylor and Bryce Petty, where they just went back and forth, lighting up the scoreboard. He's a really fun player to watch, competitive, won a lot of games, won some big games in the Big Ten as well, even got Michigan State, I believe, into the playoff that one year. I don't think it worked out very well, if I remember that game correctly, against Alabama
yes.
Crimson Tide. But I thought he showed more than enough and didn't have a whole lot of help around him at the receiver position. I want to say his most prolific receiver he was throwing to at times was Aaron Burbridge, and then maybe that kid that converted to a corner, Tony Lippett, at times. So I was giving him the benefit of the doubt, saying not a ton of NFL talent around him, a bit of a run game focus, good offensive line with Conklin and some other NFL players in front of him. But you go back, you see the accuracy concerns every year. Never once a 60% completion guy. And at this point in your college career, accuracy is a really tough thing to change for a quarterback. And he played a lot of ball, and he kind of is what he was, and didn't have the strongest arm, didn't have the most accurate arm. And those two things in combination really caught up with him as he tried to transition to his NFL career and really couldn't get on the field and take away a spot with the Raiders.
The real life Bo Callahan. I actually forgot about the story, and I was like thinking about, because I thought about using Connor Cook somewhere in this segment as well. And I remember, did he have a thing with like his birthday party? And I just Googled like Connor Cook birthday party. And yeah, there was
Yes,
a
yes, he
report where
did. Yeah.
none of his teammates came to his birthday party. It's like, yep.
That was the issue with him. I think
Right.
he was a senior and he wasn't the team captain. I
Right.
think
Yep.
that was one of the major issues with him. And just kind of dig through why was he kind of on the surface not liked or kind of coveted by his teammates.
I'll go to the next segment here. The guy that I felt just certainly outperformed my expectations was Joe Schobert. He obviously turned into a really productive player for the Cleveland Browns early in his career. I kind of viewed him as, more of a back end roster type player. Yeah, this is my summary real quick. A big body that's used to playing on the edge, best suited as a 3-4 outside linebacker, but doesn't have the length that a lot of teams covet there. So he's a bit in no man's land. His best trait was as a blitzer. His patience will be needed if he slides inside. I thought he'd be a backup Sam linebacker if he can prove that he can play special teams. He obviously shifted inside for the Browns and turned into a very, very productive player. And again, just kind of understanding the limitations of the tape, knowing what this kid can handle from a mental standpoint was huge for him. I had questions about his athleticism. He ran mid 4.7s, which, ideally you want him to be a little bit more explosive playing in the middle of the field. But no, he turned into a very productive player. And was not brought back on a second contract with Cleveland. So he ended up going and signing a big money deal with Jacksonville. And I think that is an important part of the conversation. So, there are plenty of guys that have put up big numbers as tacklers at the linebacker spot who maybe don't always quite match that on film. But Schobert certainly is a guy that outperformed my expectation.
Yeah, coincidentally here, just kind of going back into the Packers land, and I'm going to group two guys together, and Blake Martinez and Dean Lowry.
Martinez is a great example of exactly what I was just saying with Schobert.
No question. And I saw two of his games that senior year at Stanford, and I just did not see an NFL linebacker. I thought this was a kid that lacked the size, the intensity, didn't have that athleticism that you wanted. This is the same class you're studying Darren Lee, and you're studying Deion Jones, and then you put on the tape of a Blake Martinez, and it just doesn't look the same. And, you saw Jalen Smith and you saw Miles Jack. We're talking the who's who of explosive athletic linebackers from Saturdays to Sundays. And then I saw Blake Martinez, and I just didn't see enough from him that I thought he could hang on the field on third downs. And that was really kind of his knock even up to last year as a 4-year starter in Green Bay, leading the NFL and the team in tackles, I think 2 years in a row, was can he contribute in the passing game? Can he cover a running back out in the flat? And that's kind of bit him in the butt in his career in Green Bay. He's now taking a free agent deal with the New York Giants. And Dean Lowry coming out of Northwestern, bit of a T-Rex arm guy, short arm length, but a really, really tough trench player for Pat Fitzgerald there at Northwestern that had some positional versatility that I thought at times flashed some J.J. Watt type ability that I thought with his length and he has obviously a really tall frame, but shorter arms than J.J. Watt. But his just ability to win with power in the trenches there, I thought he flashed some ability. And he's really turned into a nice player and was given a contract extension last year and was one of the main reasons that they had no problem saying goodbye to Mike Daniels right before the season in 2019.
No, that's a really good point there. Kind of a parting thought here from fourth round. I just wanted to kind of get into what I feel is like a good strategy for day 3. It's like day 3 of the draft, you're either looking for guys that don't have the high upside but fit defined roles on your team. You would say like a sub-package defensive back or a goal line running back or a possession slot receiver, those kind of things. Or you're looking for guys that just have those outliers, great speed. Obviously, they fall to day 3 for a reason, but, they've got great speed or great play strength or, something that's kind of sets them apart as a great trait. And maybe they're just behind the 8 ball on some others. So that's just kind of my strategy, in terms of how I view teams looking into the third day of the draft. All right, let's go round 5. To me, it's easy. Like the best pick from this round was Tyreek Hill, right? Is there anybody else and he came, look, it was obviously a unique backstory and, he had the off-field issues at Oklahoma State and he ends up at Akron and is he a running back? Is he a receiver? Or he tests out of the charts, but what is he? And we didn't have a ton of film on him, but Tyreek Hill certainly started one of the most dynamic players regardless of position in the NFL.
I'll join you with the best player with another transfer. Who Tyreek Hill transferred from Oklahoma State and had to finish his career at West Alabama, I believe. Another transfer for completely different reasons is running back Jordan Howard, who had to leave the defunct UAB program and finish his career at University of Indiana with Nate Sudfeld and Jason Spriggs and a lot of really exciting players taking over for Tevin Coleman there in that backfield in Indiana. But he had to obviously transfer because the program at UAB collapsed and is now back, I believe. But I thought he looked really good in that first year with the Chicago Bears, rushing for 1,300 yards, and then following that up with an 1,100-yard campaign. And then, in a year and a half later, ends up getting traded to the Philadelphia Eagles. But I still think a really strong player that has more than exceeded his draft spot in being a strong back that can contribute, running between the tackles or getting himself on the perimeter. And his big knock was, what can he do, in the pass game and on third downs? But I think what they're asking him to do and being that between the tackles running back, whether the Bears or the Eagles, or now I believe he's down in Miami. And I think he's just really turned into a good, solid NFL back.
I kind of like Jordan Howard coming out of Indiana. I watched him at UAB as well, and I liked what he had put.
A lot of pro-style stuff, too. He got skinny between those holes between the tackles. He was 230, ran 4.59. I thought he had a lot of exciting tools and did some really good stuff on tape with Nate Sudfeld under center at quarterback.
If I remember right, that Ohio State game was a big one for
yes.
Coming out, if I remember right. So for me, my biggest hit was actually another guy that ended up being on the Eagles, and that's Jatavis Brown from Akron. And what I wrote down about Jatavis Brown, I think is kind of exactly what he's turned into, right? I wrote down rangy, high motor, athletic linebacker, subpar size, but I think will make up for it in a lot of ways. I think he could be a sub-package player, but his inability to kind of finish on contact was a little bit of a question for me moving into the NFL. I liked his upside, and he gets it, but he may never be a high-quality starter, and I think that's exactly what Jatavis Brown has kind of turned into, right? I mean, he was extremely productive, tested really well, just a small outside linebacker, and that's kind of what he's turned into. And I think he's going to kind of bring that to the NFL. I also loved him as a blitzer, and he was a great blitzer as well out with the Chargers.
Yeah, my day 3 version of Kenny Clark was this big nose tackle you just saw sparingly at Clemson and DJ Reader. Didn't know where nose tackle at 330 was fitting into the draft order at this stage in the NFL. I don't know how many people want a Linval Joseph or a Snacks Harrison that really doesn't contribute, with the pass. And I think that's kind of why guys like maybe Billings slid just a little bit, or some other guys that are one-dimensional slide. But DJ Reader was a really strong player for the Clemson Tigers there. Took some time off, I think, before the 2014 season. I think had a death in the family, so wasn't around the team for about half the season. But 6'3", 327, strong, long. It was just a matter of what do you think about one-dimensional players. And if you want a strong nose tackle, one shade to stop the run, that's what he is all day long. He just took a nice free agent deal to the Cincinnati Bengals, if I'm not mistaken, this past offseason.
My swing and a miss, man, was Rashard Higgins. Like, for a 5th-round pick, it's not like he has not lived up to the expectations. I'm just speaking off my personal evaluation. Like, I loved Rashard Higgins. I had him ahead of Laquan Treadwell. I had him ahead of Michael Thomas. I thought that, to me, like, his savvy as a route runner, his ball skills, his ball tracking ability. I wrote down that his upside was kind of an Antonio Brown level player, and his floor was like a Jermaine Kearse. He's obviously he's closer to that floor than he is to the ceiling. But I loved Rashard Higgins. I thought they got great value there that late in the draft, and he just has not lived up to that lofty expectation that I had for him coming out.
My swing and a miss might be an interesting pick for you, because there's some guys that didn't like him in the draft.
Okay.
But I thought Jordan Payton was going to be an NFL receiver.
I did not like Jordan Payton.
I thought he was a guy that ran an NFL-style route tree, was successful not only with Josh Rosen, but then the next year with this young Brett Hundley kid. And then I thought he had everything you wanted from that kind of possession receiver. He was about 5'11", 210. He had good size to him, good hands, got open. Maybe didn't have that explosive gear that you saw from a Will Fuller or a Corey Coleman. But I thought this was a guy that's going to be your quarterback's best friend on third down, that can get himself open, that knows the full route tree, but just could not figure it out, once he got on the field in the NFL. And I think the physicality and the lack of athleticism and speed really caught up with him once he got to the NFL.
That's a great one. Yeah, for my overachiever, you mentioned there's a lot of small school guys that have really found a lot of success from this draft, and you throw in Grand Valley State's Matt Judon on this list. And I actually watched Matt Judon when he was at Grand Valley. I wrote down really raw pass rusher with some tightness in his hips, but a high motor. If he can get with a coach to help him develop his hand usage and continue to bulk up, he could be something down the line for a 4-3 team. I don't think he's as high upside as Howard Jones was coming out of D2 He went to Shepherd University down in West Virginia. I didn't think his upside was as high as Howard Jones a couple of years ago. I had Judon as kind of like an undrafted, like developmental backup type in terms of his overall grade. Did not see him turning into what he's turned into now, which is certainly one of the better defensive linemen in the NFL.
Yeah, there's two guys here I was kind of deciding, both with some Philly connections. I got to give some love to Matt Ioannidis coming out of Temple, who's turned into a really, really good rotational trench player for the Washington Redskins. But we got to talk about Halapuli Vadi-Vaitai coming out of TCU and his contributions to the Philadelphia Eagles, particularly holding down that left tackle spot during their Super Bowl campaign. And when I go back to some of my notes at TCU, I thought this is a back-end roster guy that's going to kind of be that swing tackle, maybe even the 7th or 8th offensive lineman to a room, potentially kicking into guard, because I didn't think he had, the athleticism or maybe the flexibility to hang on the outside. But he has absolutely blown me away as a professional, both in the run game and the pass game, whether as a starter or even just coming in some spot duty, in a backup relief here and there for Jason Peters or Lane Johnson from time to time. But he has really blown me away. And to go get Big V and Isaac Seumalo in the same draft class for the Philadelphia Eagles, tremendous contributions from players they expected to be depth rotational players. And next thing you know, they're thrusted into the starting action. And it wasn't always pretty at times, but that's what happens with these young players. They're going to learn on the job. And I think those reps and maybe some of those bad moments made them better and stronger players, the ones that we've seen today. And I know Eagles fans maybe remember Big V coming in against the Redskins and struggling with Ryan Kerrigan, or maybe Isaac struggling in week 2 against the Chiefs when we announced him as starter at left guard in 2018. But since then, they've really picked up their game and have developed into strong NFL players.
All right. Let's move to round 6 then here. To me, the best pick was actually a guy that did not play for the team that drafted him, and that's Kamu Grugier-Hill. The New England Patriots selected him towards the back end of round 6. He ends up not making the team out of camp. The Eagles pick him up. Great job by the college and pro scouts for the Eagles here. They pick up Kamu off waivers. He comes in. He becomes a special teams player and eventually a starting linebacker, an eventual captain, obviously. But Kamu turned into a really nice player, especially when you're talking about what you get out of a 6th-round pick. Kamu Grugier-Hill really outperformed that draft slot. Turned into a nice player. Durability has been a little bit of a concern for him, but Kamu turning into a really nice player for the Philadelphia Eagles over the course of his career.
I kind of struggled with this one. There was a couple players I was straddling between and trying to figure out where I want to put them in the spots, but I've been really impressed with Landon Roberts coming out of the University of Houston, playing most of his time at New England Patriots. I believe he just took a free agent deal with the Miami Dolphins, but he's a guy that I think settled into a good special teams player, can play some spot duty at linebacker like we've seen, and then has really impressed us all with taking over even some fullback spots last year for the injured James Devlin and some other injuries they had. I think the Patriots were just blown away with his versatility and a physical player when I go back and look at my notes from college there. And I think really turned in one of the more productive, stable linebackers in this kind of turbulent class with some undersized athletic players, maybe some oversized guys and Josh Perry and Reggie Ragland. But Landon Roberts, a really good mix of the two at 6 foot, 238. And I know you were just watching the other day that Auburn linebacker, KJ Britt, who reminds me a lot of a Landon Roberts style of player. Very similar size, very similar play temperament and style that I think, I want a little bit longer, a little bit more athletic. But if you can play with that physicality and that sort of toughness and that versatility, you're getting yourself a really good NFL player.
It's a good one. To me, if I'm going to look at my biggest hit in this class, I'm going to go with the UTSA tight end, David Morgan. I like David Morgan, man. Like I thought that he could be like an Owen Daniels type player in terms of his upside, but I thought he'd be a really strong, like number 2 or number 3 tight end. And I think he's turned into that, a really nice, reliable piece for the Minnesota Vikings in that offense. He does a lot of different things for them. Again, talking about what you're getting in the 6th round, I thought he certainly has outperformed that slot and kind of lived up to how I viewed him coming out. Another small school player, by the way, that has found success in the league.
I'm just going to kind of piggyback two categories here because I agree. I like David Morgan. He's a guy that put his hand down in the turf for UTSA, kind of a pro-style run game from that pistol offense, and moved defensive ends in the run game. And I think that's what the Minnesota Vikings got immediately, was a tight end that was going to be able to contribute in the run game. And then let's see if we can leak him out in play action. But conversely, David Morgan may not have been the sexiest player. My biggest miss in this draft, Fran, was Darrell Adams, the big athletic basketball playing looking tight end from South Carolina, goes to the New York Giants. And I thought we're getting that next wave of above the rim player. I thought maybe we're getting, a new age kind of Shannon Sharp, style of tight end that can play above the rim, that's going to be really athletic, that could win with speed, maybe the next year Michael Finley style of player with a lot of that background in basketball, with a big butt, with springy bounce and good hands. And I completely missed on that one because he struggled to get himself on the field as a young player for the New York Giants that I thought was the new wave, athletic tight end that everybody wanted in the NFL.
My swing and a miss was DeAndre Houston Carson out of William and Mary.
You loved him.
Dude, I loved him. He reminded me of like Clinton Dix coming out of Alabama. In terms of he had that athleticism. He was built the same way that was. He was a former corner that asked to get moved to safety because he wanted to be more involved on an every down basis in the run game. And I looked at this kid and I thought, man, like this guy's got a lot of the traits to look. And he has stuck. So it's not like he hasn't lived up to the 6th round pick. But I thought he was a future starter. Like I thought he had the ability to come in and be an every down player.
And if I remember correctly, had an awesome week down there in Mobile at the Senior Bowl. I think not only in coverage, but against the run and team periods, one-on-ones. And anytime you get those safety corner hybrids down there, everybody kind of just stops what they're doing. And it makes me think of like Demarius Randall, that safety corner there. You just think they could do everything on the back end. And he had really good size, was a fluid player, a guy that everybody kind of gravitated towards in the interviews and all that stuff off the field. That's a big part of Senior Bowl week. Seemed like a really good kid. And I remember you just telling me, watch this kid. And we were both happy. He ended up getting drafted and just could not figure out why he couldn't squeeze his way onto the field early in his career with the Chicago Bears, I believe.
Well, he had a couple of safeties ahead. He had Eddie Jackson, who I loved, and he had Adrian Amos ahead of him as well. And I think he's just kind of stuck as a backup, which, again, going back to what you're looking for in a 6th round pick is perfectly fine. My overachiever is also in the secondary in this class, and that's Anthony Brown out of Purdue. Dude, I watched him and I didn't see it. Like, I didn't see the instincts in man coverage. I didn't see the ball skills. I was like, I just don't know, what value this guy certainly brings on the outside. And he actually has fit into a solid player for the Dallas Cowboys. He's played inside. He's played outside. He has certainly surpassed my expectation. I can't really, I don't want to sit here and say, oh, man, this is what I got wrong. But I'll just say, he's certainly, outperformed what I anticipated for him coming out of Purdue.
Yeah, and Fran, I swear I wrote these notes last night, and I did not mean to make these skewed towards the Eagles. But as I'm going through it, I'm seeing Sayomalo and Big V and Kamo Grugier-Hill, and coincidentally, I have Will Parks written down here as my overachiever coming out of the Arizona Wildcat program there, being a 6th round pick. Philadelphia native as well, coming from Germantown Academy, I believe. But coming out of Arizona as a big kind of hybrid safety as well, he was 6'1", 194 and ran 4.63. And I just did not think he was going to have the speed and the athleticism to be that kind of core special teams player and that hybrid safety corner. And he's really impressed me on the back end of the Denver Broncos. And they got 2 really good players in this draft, Justin Simmons, number 1, and then Will Parks there, number 2. And Will Parks has been that strong safety and played a lot of good snaps at slot corner for them as well the past couple of years. So he's proven he can cover. He's proven he can play a variety of positions. And that has tremendous value, especially on day 3. And I think that's what you want out of these players. Maybe guys that can wear a couple different hats for you. And I think Will Parks has turned into a really nice NFL player. And, the overachieving can kind of be a backhanded compliment because it's saying we maybe didn't expect that out of them. But obviously somebody else didn't expect it because they're 6th round picks. And I think what he's turned into as an NFL player and now a current Philadelphia Eagle, really excited to watch him this summer.
Let's go to round 7. And the guy that was my number 4 safety in this class, I loved this player at LSU in the secondary, Jalen Mills. stick with the Eagles theme, man. I loved Jalen Mills, and you go back. They're still on YouTube. They're still on the Eagles website. You can go back to the breakdowns that Greg Cosell and I did of Jalen Mills right when he got drafted, and I was like, I had like a permanent smile stuck on my face because I was just like so excited that the Eagles ended up with him. I felt like he was a day 2 talent, a guy that had that versatility to do a lot of different things. He played everywhere in the secondary for LSU. He was a 4-year starter. He came in day 1 and became a starter at corner, and now he's making that transition inside as kind of a matchup safety here in 2020. But dude, I thought, to me, like, slam dunk, he was the best pick in this draft in the 7th round. And to me, also, honestly, I'll double dip here. He was my biggest hit as well, just because I had a lot of faith that Jalen Mills was going to stick in the NFL and be a starting caliber player, and he has proven that.
Yeah, that's a really good pick right there. And just kind of going off the heels of some of those offensive linemen I mentioned before, the non-sexy trench players, the Ted Karras, the Wes Schweitzer, Isaac Seumalo, and that's kind of front and center. That's what Austin Blythe was coming out of the University of Iowa. And, when in doubt, just go get a big, ugly Big Ten offensive lineman out of Wisconsin or Iowa that you could plug and play. And he's proven it. He's played left guard, right guard, center, a lot of that stuff kind of in spot duty at the drop of a hat. Started his career with the Colts and has transitioned to a really nice role depth player for the Los Angeles Rams. Was a starter the past 2 years. It's been just a really impressive trench player. And I think that's kind of what the Iowa Hawkeyes pump out. There's a lot of day 3 players that come out of this program and a lot of guys that hang around in the NFL for 8, 10, 12 years. And I just love seeing those kind of back-end players, particularly in the 7th round, particularly guys out of the Big Ten, like programs like Wisconsin and Iowa that just pump out great NFL professionals.
He was the wrestler of the year, his high school senior year. I loved Blythe on film. I just really worried about his size. I didn't see that position versatility for him in the NFL. I wondered, does he have the ability to play guard? And I wrote down that, like kind of a Jason Kelce level of comparison for him. He didn't test as well as Kelce did, but he kind of played to that athleticism on film. I just questioned whether or not he had that versatility. We talked about how important versatility is for young offensive linemen on day 3. I didn't know that he had that, and he's proven to this point that he did. For me, like, my biggest swing and a miss was Daniel Braverman, the slot receiver from Western Michigan. He came out the year after Corey Davis was a top 5 pick. This is the year before. Yeah, goes Corey Davis 2017. But, dude, I loved Braverman, man. I thought that he could step in and really kind of be that possession slot receiver, short area, great route runner, reliable hands. Not a great athlete, but a guy that could just get it done in the middle of the field, and just never was able to find a way to stick, man. I know size was a question, but I really liked Braverman, and he just was unable to stick. I really struggle with those guys, man. Like, you watch them and you're like, all right, well, yeah, like this guy, why can't this guy be, insert name of like the short, squatty, not athletic slot receivers that Bill Belichick seems to always have like all the success with, and other teams as well. Why can't he be Cole Beasley? Why can't he be this guy? And then you see so many of them that don't make it. So it's tough. But Braverman was one of those guys that I was high on that just didn't find a way to meet that mark.
Yeah, that's a really good pick there. In my notes here, first and foremost, I have beat Marshawn Lattimore for a 55-yard touchdown on a slot fade the year before he came out. So he has shown he could beat some top-level NFL talent as well, despite playing at Western Michigan out there. Who's the kid? I'm going to put you on the spot here for a second. Who's a similar type of player like that? He was a receiver coming out of Colorado a couple years ago. I think he was on Nelson Spruce is another one that I thought was that type of player. Now, Spruce had some injuries coming out immediately as a rookie, which always is going to hurt you if you're a day 3 guy with injuries. That's a really tough thing to overcome there. My biggest miss is going to be Alex McAllister, coming out of the University of Florida. Looked the part, 6'6", 255, 260, long player that had this really interesting patented dip move around the corner for a long, tall player. You just get the offensive tackles to shoot their hands, and he just swoop underneath it. And it looked exactly what you wanted from a player with that size, that length, that frame, and the flexibility to turn the corner. And that's what you want out of 7th-round picks. And the Eagles did everything they could to squeak him through some practice squads for a couple years and continue to develop his game, and just couldn't click it all together and earn himself playing time. Was a little bit limited in his ability to contribute on special teams and some of that stuff that really gets those young players roster spots. But he was a guy that I thought would a little bit more suited to be an NFL pass rusher than maybe a Shaq Lawson or even a Kevin Dodd that had double-digit sacks for the Clemson Tigers. And I just thought Alex McAllister really looked the part for a 7th-round pick.
Yeah, in the same round, I thought Stephen Weatherly coming out of Vanderbilt, if he'd be my overachiever. He was long and he was athletic, but he played Sam linebacker, and I was like, I just don't know. It's kind of a developmental player. I sat around 7. That's what you're taking anyway. But he's turned into a nice rotational piece, man, for Minnesota. It's been a part of that pass rush package for Mike Zimmer. So certainly has outlived what I kind of anticipated.
Yeah, this one was a little bit tough for me, in my opinion. But, when you get into the 7th round, there may not always be that defensive stalwart, but maybe someone who's just kind of that back-end leader and a special teams captain. And I've seen this player kind of take a similar trajectory to a Chris Maragos, and that's Clayton Fejedelem, who played a lot of ball for the Cincinnati Bengals, primarily on special teams, but would come in and contribute spot duty, safety play, especially in their sub packages and dimes when they like to get 3 safeties on the field. He's a guy that came out of Illinois that I wasn't sure was going to be a draftable player, but I think just his versatility and his willingness to be a core 4 special teamer, and I think the captain of that special teams group for a couple of years, just is a really good reason why that 7th rounder is kind of an overachieving status, in my opinion. Another guy, keep clicking on their profiles, that seem to be taking free agent deals to Miami all over the place here. I already mentioned Landon Roberts and Jordan Howard, and seems like everybody else is on their way down to South Beach out there. But Clayton Fejedelem, definitely an overachiever for a 7th-round pick.
Yeah, started his career at St. Xavier, was it?
Yes.
Yeah, St. Xavier, and was a really productive player. Ended up left there and walked on to Illinois. So just a really interesting background. So this was fun, man. It's not often, obviously, that we can, it's like you said at the top, we don't often look back. So it's kind of fun here to just kind of take some time and look back at our thoughts and some takeaways from the draft from a few years ago. I'm always kind of doing it, but being able to do it in a content form was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you got to check the receipts out the back door, and especially for guys that aren't making picks, and there's a lot of media analysts out there, and sometimes they put their big boards and their grades out there and they want to do the redraft. But I like really getting to the nuts and bolts of each pick and maybe who was available at that selection and why there is success and failure in the NFL. And there's so many different reasons for success and failure, and these guys are all talented athletically. And there's so many other reasons aside from athleticism and what you do on the field. And each case study is really unique and different. And it's like fingerprints. Each one is different. Each story is different. Each path is different. And you really have to study these stories to be better as an evaluator moving forward. And I think that's what we're both trying to do, is just learn from the past.
No question. Well, Ben, thanks so much for joining us once again. We'll talk to you again next week.
Well, I hope you guys really enjoyed that. Again, long episode, different kind of episode than we typically do, but I know a lot of you out there, when you filled out that survey this offseason about what you wanted to see, a lot of people asked for kind of look backs at previous drafts. And so hopefully we tried to accomplish that here today with a look back to the 2016 NFL draft. Again, just a reminder, if you can, please leave us a rating, leave us a comment on wherever you listen, whether it's on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. Hope you guys are subscribed. Stay subscribed. Again, I've got some big news for this podcast coming up here in the next couple of weeks. Until then, we will see you next week right here on the Journey to the Draft podcast, driven by AAA.